High on Sunder Ridge, 25 years of silence ended with a single sound. Not a gunshot. A voice, broken human, calling one word into the dark and the rain, help. 6 covered wagons stood in the mountain meadow, canvas still stretched over the bows, coffee pot still upright on the driver's seat, a child's shoes with their laces tied in careful bows as though 18 souls had simply stepped out of the grass one morning and never come back. 25 years. And no one in the valley below had ever asked why. One man knew. He had built a town on the silence, and now a girl in a dead man's coat was standing in that meadow in the rain holding proof that would destroy him. She dropped the rope and walked toward the voice. The coat was too big for her. That was the first thing anyone noticed about Nora Voss on the morning she left Garnet Bend forever, not the 2 saddlebags she'd packed the night before, not the way she'd braided her hair tight against the cold, not the ache in her jaw from 3 months of keeping her mouth shut when the right answer was always silence. The coat. Her father's coat. Brown tweed worn soft at the elbows, the collar turned up against October air that had teeth in it already, the hem hanging past her hips, because Garrett Voss had been a broad man who took up space in a room, and his daughter had not inherited that particular quality of presence. She'd inherited his stubbornness instead, his way of going quiet before he spoke, his refusal to cry where anyone could see him. She was doing that now. Not crying. Standing in the livery yard with her hands on Juniper's saddle straps, pulling the buckle tight, then tighter, then tight enough that the mare turned her head and gave Nora a look that said the straps were fine, and had been fine for the last 10 minutes, and perhaps the problem was something other than the straps. I know, Nora told the horse, under her breath, to the cold dark of the yard before Garnet Bend woke up and remembered she existed. Juniper was 16 years old and built like a woman who had seen everything twice, and was no longer surprised by any of it. Bay coat gone dark with age, white star on her forehead the color of old piano keys. She had been Garrett Voss's horse before she was Nora's, and she carried that history in the particular steadiness of her, the way she planted her feet, the way she breathed, unhurried and low, like a heartbeat that had decided it would not be rushed by anyone. Nora had been riding her since she could reach the stirrups. She pressed her forehead now against the warm bone of the mare's jaw, just for a moment. One moment in which Garnet Bend did not exist and Edmund Hale did not exist, and the fact of her father's death did not sit in her chest like a stone that had been there so long she'd stopped noticing the weight until she tried to breathe deeply and couldn't. Then she straightened, pulled the second saddlebag up, checked the buckle she'd already checked 4 times, because there was nothing left to do but go. The road out of Garnet Bend ran east before it bent north, and she did not look back at the Cornerstone Hotel when she passed it. She had learned that lesson 3 months ago when she'd walked out of that building, with her father's death still wet on her hands, and the knowledge of what Edmund Hale had just said settling into her bones like cold. You look back and you find a reason to stay. You find a reason and you use it. And then another season passes and the lease you couldn't renew is someone else's lease now, and you are still rinsing dishes in steam that smells of lard, and the back of the kitchen still smells like failure dressed up as survival. She did not look back. The sky above the false fronts of the main street was pale at the edges and deep where the stars were giving up, and the first birds were somewhere in the cottonwoods along the creek, beginning their argument with the morning. Garnet Bend was a town that took a while to wake up, that had always felt like a personal insult. When she was a child, the whole world drowsing while she was already restless, already watching the ridge that rose north of town with the particular attention of someone who doesn't know yet why they keep looking at something. She knew now. She hadn't known then. Her father hadn't told her. Her father had told her almost nothing about the ridge, about the road that climbed it, about the spring of 1861 when 6 covered wagons had gone up that road, and not one of them had come down. She'd been a girl small enough to sit on his boot while he mended tack when she'd asked him once where he'd lived before Garnet Bend. He'd kept working the awl for a while without answering, the leather pulling tight in his hands, and then he'd said only that he had been somewhere he could not go back to. And he had not said it like a man describing a place. He'd said it like a man describing a wound. She had learned not to ask again. 3 months ago, the fever had taken him in the span of 4 days, which was both too fast and somehow too slow, because there was a space somewhere in the middle of it when she'd thought he might turn, when his eyes had focused and found her face, and she'd thought he was coming back to himself. But the look he'd given her wasn't the look of a man returning. It was the look of a man trying to say something he didn't have enough time left to say. He hadn't said it. The morning after the funeral, Edmund Hale had come to the house. She had known who he was before she opened the door. She had grown up knowing who Edmund Hale was. The way children in small towns grow up, knowing which houses on the street you don't run past too loud, and which men in the feed store you don't make eye contact with when their mood is on them. Hale was not that kind of man. That would have been simpler. Hale was the kind of man who wore a 3-button vest of black wool even in August, who kept a gold watch on a chain so fine it caught light like a whisper, whose boots were always buffed to a shine that suggested either a great deal of personal vanity or a great deal of available time, and probably both. He was broad and well-fed, and he wore his prosperity the way other men wore their best coat deliberately, for effect, because he had decided long ago that the appearance of success was indistinguishable from success itself if you held it long enough. He stood on her porch with his hat in his hands, which was not humility, it was performance. "I'm sorry for your loss," he'd said, and he'd said it in a voice like butter just before it browns, warm and smooth and just on the edge of too much. "Your father was a good man. Garnet Bend will feel his absence." Nora had stood in the doorway, with her father's body still in the front room, and said nothing, because she'd heard something in the pause after those words that told her the condolence was the opening, not the point. She'd been right. The lease on the creek bottom pasture, Hale had explained, was in arrears on its last quarter's payment. Garrett had been sick for longer than Nora had understood, had been managing worse than he'd let on, had let things slide that a man in better health would have caught. The note was held, as it happened, by the Garnet Bend Land and Cattle Company, of which Hale was the principal, and a renewal, he regretted to say, required a signature from the leaseholder of record, and a girl of her age and standing. He'd used that word, standing, and it had been so carefully chosen, she felt the edge of it carried no legal standing to execute that renewal. He'd said all of it while the clock on the mantel kept ticking. He'd said all of it in the voice of a man explaining a natural event. Rain falls, wells run dry. Girls with dead fathers and no standing cannot hold leases. The gate had swung shut behind her 6 weeks after that conversation. The neighbors had already begun to look through her, in the way people look through weather on a far-field present, inconvenient, sure to pass. She'd packed what fit into 2 saddlebags. She'd slept in the hay above Halsey's livery, up among the mice and the smell of harness leather and the particular chill that settles into gable spaces when October decides to mean it. She'd washed dishes at the Cornerstone Hotel for her board, and she'd learned that a woman who says nothing and hears everything is never charged for the hearing. She listened to everything. She was good at it because her father had been good at it, and she had learned from watching him that silence was not the same as absence. Would you treat them with kindness? You could be in a room and hear everything, and let people forget you were there, and they would say things in front of you they'd never say in front of someone they remembered. The freighters who came down from the high camps forgot about her between the soup course and the main, and by the time the coffee came they were telling each other things they'd told each other a dozen times before. Because men who travel the same roads tell the same stories, and the repetition is the point, the repetition is the warmth. It was on a wet October night 3 weeks before the morning she left that she heard the story for the first time. The man telling it was big through the chest and soft at the middle, wearing a canvas duster that had dried stiff at the collar and smelled of horse and old smoke. He was warming his hands over the stove at the back of the kitchen, where Nora was rinsing plates, and he was talking to the cook's helper, a young man who had the look of someone who had heard this story before and was going to hear it again and had made his peace with that. Spring of 1861, the freighter said. 6 wagons, 18 souls if you counted right. Up the old ridge road north of town, up past the last switchback, up into country the freighter described with a particular mixture of decisiveness and unease that told Nora he was more frightened of it than he was willing to say directly. They'd gone up and they hadn't come down. The mountain kept what it took. He said that last part like it was a proverb the whole world had agreed on long ago. Then he laughed, the way certain men laugh at things that frighten them, pushing the fear back, out of reach with sound. Nora set down the plate she was holding. Where does the ridge road start? She'd asked it plainly, the way she asked every question. not adjusting the words to make them more comfortable for the person receiving them. The freighter stopped laughing. He looked at her, the way men look at women who have asked a question they've decided belongs to them. The look that says, not because you're wrong, but because who gave you permission? Then he told her, because she was a girl rinsing dishes in a kitchen, and there was no earthly reason not to tell her, and the telling cost him nothing. And men who feel no threat are careless with information, in the way people are careless with things they don't believe are valuable. The road started above the last switchback beyond the large fork. It climbed from there into country that gave nothing back. She asked no more questions. She finished the plates. She did not sleep well that night. 3 days after that conversation, Nora brought it up at the long table of the Cornerstone Hotel, not because she had failed to think it through, but because she had thought it all the way through and decided the only way to find out whether the story was real was to ask about it openly, in front of people who would tell her the truth, not because they were generous, but because they wanted to be the ones who told it. She'd miscalculated. Edmund Hale was at the head of the table, as he was most evenings, occupying his chair with the ease of a man who has sat in the same seat long enough that the furniture has shaped itself around him. He'd heard her question about the ridge, about the road, about whether anyone had ever gone up to see what remained, and he'd turned in his chair to look at her, in the same way he'd looked at her on her porch the morning after her father died. The look of a man who has already made a calculation and is explaining the result to someone who won't be in the room much longer. Going up alone, he'd said. Not a question. A categorization, I am. She'd met his eyes and kept hers level. His mouth had curved without any warmth reaching anywhere else on his face. He'd spread his hands, generous, amused, the way a man is amused when the joke is the other person's dignity and he's not worried about consequence. Go then. The pause before the next part had been deliberate, studied. He'd known how it would land and had thrown it anyway. A girl and a foundered horse. The mountain will keep you both. Save the county the cost of another eviction. The table had laughed. Not all of it, not all at once, but enough of it in a ripple that moved from Hale's end outward like he'd lit a fuse. The drover across from her snorted into his cup. The woman at the far end, with flour still white in the crook of her sleeve, said something loud enough to reach the door about the Voss girl, losing her father and her good sense in the same hard season. And Nora had stood there with the words landing in her the way such words are designed to land, not to wound precisely, but to place. To set a person outside the circle of sensible, warm people who know better, who know enough, who know when to stop. She had walked out into the street where the cold came through the tweed and found the skin beneath. She stood a long moment between the livery and the wheelwright's shop with her hands shaking. Not from cold. Not quite from anger either. Though anger was in there, anger had always been in there, a low, steady, banked thing she'd been managing her whole life, because her father had shown her without ever naming the lesson that the only anger worth having was the kind you could work with, the kind you could shape into something useful. The shaking was the effort of keeping her mouth shut, the knowledge that any answer she gave would only feed them. The old woman came out of the darkness between the buildings. Nora had seen her before. Everyone in Garnet Bend had seen Cora Wynn before she'd been there longer than most of the buildings, living in the low house behind the churchyard, moving through the town without making sound, wrapped in a shawl the color of ash from a fire that has been cold a long time. Children dared each other to knock on her door. Musses them not to stare. They stared anyway. Cora Wynn had the kind of face that invites staring not because it is unusual, but because it seems to be looking at something no one else in the room can see. She stopped in front of Nora and looked up into her face, and her eyes in the thin lamplight from the livery door were that pale shade of blue-gray that river ice turns just before it goes. Child. She waited, and Nora waited with her, because there was nothing to say to a woman like this but to wait and see what came next. What they left up there was not lost. The voice was low and even, worn smooth as a creekstone from long use. It was kept. Mind which one you become. Then she turned and was gone down the alley, quick and quiet as a thought. Nora stood with the words turning in her and could not fit them to any door she knew. She had gone to Amos Redd's wheelwright shop the next morning with the specific intention of buying a coil of rope and a hoof pick. That was what she had told herself. She wanted rope. She was practical about it. A person who is going up a ridge road alone needs good rope and does not need to explain why she's going. Amos Red was 68 years old, and built like someone who had spent those years arguing with iron and winning about half the time. His hands were broad and darkened permanently at the knuckles from pine tar and the particular intimacy of working metal for decades. He had known Garrett Voss before Nora was born, and he spoke of it rarely, and never at length, and in the way that men speak of things they consider too important for casual mention. He watched Nora count out her coins without comment, and he handed over the rope and the hoof pick, and he did not say anything about the ridge road while she was still in the shop. It was when the rope was already coiled over her shoulder that he spoke. "Your father set a hitch on a grain sack," Amos said, "that I never saw another hand match." She turned. He was reaching above his workbench for something she hadn't noticed, a scrap of hide, rolled, pinned to the wall with a single nail above a row of tools. He brought it down and unrolled it on the wood between them, and on it, in faded brown ink that dried to the color of old blood, someone had drawn a line that climbed, 3 marks along it that she read as creek crossings. At the top of the line, a wide place marked with a small square. Around the square, a scatter of dots that might have been stones or wagon wheels, or the attempt of an uncertain hand to mark the presence of something too large for a single symbol. "Fellow left this here a lifetime ago," Amos said, "and never came for it. I always meant to burn it. Never could." Nora looked at the line and the square and the dots and felt something shift behind her ribs. Something that had been held in position for a long time releasing fraction. "Why give it to me?" He rolled the hide and pressed it into her hand and closed her fingers over it with both of his big hands. "Work dark, careful." His eyes went to the window where the sky above the false fronts showed a thin high line of cloud coming in from the west, spread like fingers across the flat blue. "Because you're the only one in 3 months to ask a straight question about that country instead of a joke." He didn't release her hand immediately. "When the cloud comes off sunder flat on the bottom and torn on the top, you find cover and you don't argue with it. That country makes its own storms." She'd thanked him and gone, and she had not looked back because she was afraid of finding a reason to stay, and there was no longer anything in Garnet Bend to stay for. So that was how she left. That was the whole of the inventory. 2 saddlebags, 1 rope, 1 hoof pick, 1 scrap of hide with a drawn line on it, and the sentence Cora Wynn had said in the dark that Nora still couldn't fully fit to any shape she knew. She rode east until the road bent north, and then she rode north until the road became something else, a suggestion rather than an intention, a faint pressing down of the earth where wheels had run and frost had eaten, and 25 winters had worked at erasing what the wagons had done. She let Juniper choose her footing. This was not passivity. This was the thing her father had taught her without ever naming it as a lesson. A horse that knows she's trusted does not waste that trust. They made camp the first night under a leaning cedar that smelled of pitch and cold. Nora did not light a fire. She ate cold biscuit and dried venison that had gone hard at the edges, and she drank from her canteen, and the water tasted of tin and the particular loneliness of being the only person in a large darkness. Above her, through the cedar's gaps, the stars came out in numbers that made the sky seem structural. Rather than decorative, the stars were load-bearing up here, holding something up, keeping something from collapsing. She lay on her back with her hat over her eyes, and thought about the fact that she had nothing left the world could take from her, and she thought that this should feel worse than it did, and wondered what it meant that it didn't. She woke before dawn to frost on the mare's mane and her own blanket and the cedar's lower branches, a silver layering that turned everything unfamiliar, and she rubbed Juniper's forehead, and the horse leaned into it with the pure animal willingness to receive warmth from anything that offered it. The second day the country changed. The pines thinned and the granite began to push up through the thin soil in gray slabs that looked like the bones of something enormous and patient, and the air sharpened until she could taste the shape of the mountain in it, pine sap and old snow, and beneath both the mineral cold of stone that had never been warm all the way through. A jay called once from a dead snag and received no answer. She crossed the first creek at a stony ford and let Juniper drink, then crossed the second an hour on. Near midday she came to the third creek, wider than the others, running fast and clear over a bed of pale rounded rock. She got down and let the mare drink and drank herself, kneeling on a flat stone, and the water was so cold it ached in her back teeth and tasted of granite and snowmelt and nothing else at all. She was climbing back up the near bank when the country opened ahead of her. It didn't announce itself. The timber simply stepped back on both sides, and the ground leveled, and she crested the lip of the approach, and there before her was a long shallow bowl of grass under a pale and attentive sky, ringed all around by dark standing timber so still and vertical it seemed less like trees, and more like a held breath made architectural. Late frost lay unmelted in the shadowed places along the tree line. The grass in the bowl was tall and winter-bleached, and in the middle of that stillness, arranged in a rough arc that she registered first as shape before she registered as meaning, stood 6 forms she had ridden 2 days to find. 6 covered wagons. She drew Juniper up at the meadow's edge and did not dismount. She had told herself the freighter's story would prove to be exactly that, a story. She had told herself she would find splinters and rusted iron, the scatter of collapsed wood, the ordinary devastation that time performs on things left without protection. What she found instead stole the breath from her chest in a way that was not quite fear and not quite wonder, and had no name she could put to it in that first moment. The canvas tops were sagged and gray as driftwood, but they were stretched still over the bows. The wagon tongues rested down in the sod, pointing away, as though the teams had only just been unhooked and led off to water and would return before the light failed. 6 wagons. Intact. 25 years of mountain winters and they were intact. Juniper stopped at the meadow's edge and would not proceed. Nora sat the refusal without fighting it, because she had learned from this mare that a horse who stops before you ask her to stop has read something you haven't read yet. The mare stood with her ears hard forward, and her nostrils working, turning through the still air for whatever was in it, taking her time. The meadow gave nothing back. It simply held its silence with the patience of a thing that has been holding silence for a very long time and has found it sufficient. Then slowly Juniper stepped forward, one hoof, then another. The hesitation of a horse stepping into water she does not yet trust, testing the depth. Nora did not push her. They walked the arc together, horse and rider, Nora's eyes moving from wagon to wagon. She did not touch anything on that first pass. She read it the way you read a letter from someone you've lost carefully, with the knowledge that every word counts and you will not get another. The nearest wagon was a plain box on iron-strapped wheels. The canvas had a long tear near the front bow, where wind had worked at a weak seam over years, and through that tear, in the slanting afternoon light, she could see the shapes of things a family carries when it means to make a new life at the far end of a long road. A flour barrel, a cast-iron pot lashed to a rib with rope gone stiff and gray, a quilt folded and stacked with an attention to corners that hurt her somehow, that made her chest do the thing it did when she'd seen her father's boots beside the door the morning after he died, placed just so because he'd always placed them just so. In another wagon, a pair of leather shoes stood side by side, their laces tied in neat bows. In another, an open book lay face down on a folded shawl, its pages yellowed but uncurled, sheltered by nothing but canvas and 25 years of luck. No bones, no blood, no mark of struggle anywhere in that meadow, no scatter, no ruin, no sign of any human failing at all. Only the wagons and what they held, as though 18 souls had stepped out of the grass together between one breath and the next, and simply walked into the trees without intention of return, which was not the same as departure. Nora sat down in the grass. Her knees had stopped cooperating, and she honored that without drama. She sat, and the mare came and stood over her, lowering her long head, and Nora put her forehead against the warm bone of Juniper's jaw, and let her heart do what it needed to do in the dark between one breath and the next. She was not crying. She was doing the other thing, the thing that happens before crying, when the body understands something enormous before the mind has caught up. The meadow held its silence around them both. She made her camp that evening at the outer edge of the arc where the grass grew rich and the ground sloped just enough to shed water, and she picketed Juniper there and pulled the saddle and set it upright against a wheel. She did not build a fire that first night. She was not ready to bring flame into that circle. She could not have explained why, except that the place did not feel abandoned, and fire would have announced her presence in a way that felt presumptuous, as though the meadow had accepted her as a visitor, and she was not yet sure what she intended to do with that. She ate the last of the biscuit and watched the light drain out of the sky degree by degree, gray to violet to deep blue, and when the first star came, the wagons beneath it looked less like abandoned property and more like something waiting. There was a difference. She was becoming able to distinguish it. She woke once before dawn to a low creak from the nearest wagon, as though a body had shifted its weight inside. She lay still with her hand on the knife at her belt, and the sound did not repeat, and after a while Juniper blew softly through her nose the easy, comfortable exhalation of a horse that senses nothing wrong, and Nora let her hand ease off the knife and lay in the dark until sleep came back. Dawn in the high country arrived slowly and without drama. The stars relinquished one by one. The timber went from black to the deep green of water held still. A thin, colorless light filled the bowl before the sun itself cleared the eastern ridge and struck the dew on the grass and turned the whole meadow for one long trembling minute into a field of small bright fire. Nora walked the ark in the new light to confirm she had not dreamed it. Everything was as it had been. Coffee pot on the driver's seat, shoes with their bows, book on its shawls. She stopped at the second wagon, smaller than the first, narrower, with the particular close-drawn look of a vehicle packed by someone who knew exactly what space was worth. She set her hand flat on the cold, damp wood of the wheel and felt the grain of it under her palm. Older than she was, older than most things she had ever touched. Something drew her to the canvas at the front bow where a leather thong had been looped through a brass grommet and tied off in a knot. She recognized the knot before she recognized that she was recognizing it. Her hands went still on the leather. It was the hitch. Her father's hitched the knot she had watched him tie across the tailgate of the hay wagon, across feed bags stacked in the barn, across the canvas of her own childhood wrapped in the ordinary ritual of a man who was precise about small things because he had learned that small things were the hinge on which large things turned. It was not a rare knot. She knew that. Other hands made it. But there was a quality to the particular way this knot sat, the specific tension of it, the angle of the final tuck, that hit her low in the sternum and held. She worked it loose with hands that were not quite steady. It came apart without a snag, smooth and clean, the way a knot releases when it was tied correctly to begin with, without the argument of poor workmanship or rot. Inside, the light was the color of weak tea filtering through the weathered canvas. A bedroll along one side still rolled and tied, a carpet bag at its foot. Draped once atop the bag, a man's shirt of undyed linen, the collar frayed soft, the cuffs mended in small even stitches by patient hands. From a hook on the second bow, a man's felt hat hung black once, faded now to the color of wood smoke, with a narrow band of braided horsehair around the crown. She was turning to climb back down when she saw the mark. It was cut into the inner face of the sideboard, low no higher than her knee where she crouched, in the angle where a man sitting with his back against the board might rest in a moment of idleness, and take out his knife without thinking, the way people do when their hands need something to occupy them, while their mind works at other things. Scratched there with a blade point, small and patient and deep enough to last. A cross first, then beside the cross 3 letters, and below the letters a number. She read the letters once, then again. The breath left her softly, all at once, the way a horse exhales at the top of a long climb. The 3 letters were her father's initials. The number below them was 1861. She stayed crouched for a long time. The mare tore up a clump of grass outside and chewed it, and the small green sound of that was enormous in the stillness. Her father had never once in her 23 years spoken of this ridge, had never spoken of this road. Had come into Garnet Bend the year she was born with 1 horse and a saddle, and no story that anyone had ever succeeded in getting out of him, and he had taken the lease on the creek bottom, and kept his own counsel through every season after that, until the fever had closed his eyes. She had asked him only once about what came before, when she was a girl small enough to perch on his boot, and he had said only the one thing somewhere he could not go back to, and she had learned not to press because she had understood even then, at whatever age children understand such things without knowing the words for it, that what he could not go back to was not a place but a condition. A version of himself he had left behind. She reached out and laid 2 fingers against the carved letters, once, lightly. The way she had laid them against his forehead the last night before the fever took the last of his knowing and he went somewhere she could not follow. Then she drew the canvas back over the bow, threaded the leather thong through the brass grommet, and tied it off with his hitch, exactly as she had found it, and the doing of that, the returning of the knot, to the position it had held for 25 years, steadied her more than any word could have. She climbed down from the wagon, and walked out into the middle of the meadow, and stood there with her arms loose at her sides, while the sun finished its work on the dew and the field of small fire gradually became just grass again. The morning's work was in front of her and she went at it, because her hands needed occupation, while her mind worked through the thing that was too large to be held all at once. The wagon tongues had sunk deep into the sod, and 2 of them showed rot on the underside where moisture had been getting in. She cut straight saplings at the meadow's edge and trimmed them into props, and levered the tongues up an inch at a time, scraping the black wood clean and letting air reach it. The canvas on 3 wagons had bowed where the boughs beneath had cracked. She found pieces of serviceable wood in the storm-opened 5th wagon and fashioned new supports, lashing them with rope. Work that had meaning. Work that the meadow had needed someone to do for longer than she had been alive. It was the midday breakwater from the creek at the meadow's western edge, cold enough to ache, that gave her the angle she needed. She stood on the far bank, looking back at the 6 wagons, and saw for the first time the shape they made. Not a circle, not a full arc. An arc open on one side, deliberate in its incompleteness, the gap oriented east. She had spent enough seasons in country like this, had heard enough of its stories in the kitchens of enough remote towns, to know how people drew wagons when they feared attack, tight and closed, wheel to wheel, a ring with no entrance. This was the inverse. Whoever had arranged these wagons had not been defending against anything. They had been leaving a door open. The opening faced the trail she had ridden up, the east, the trail down to the valley, to the town, to the world below. Someone had gone down that trail, and the people left behind had arranged their wagons into a shape that meant we are here. We are still here. We are waiting. She sat on a cold, flat stone on the bank of the creek and looked at that open eastern gap until the sun had moved enough to warm the back of her neck. Then she rose and went back to work, because she was not ready yet for what she was beginning to understand. And work was the one language that could hold her while understanding arrived at its own pace. She began emptying the first wagon in the late afternoon, not deciding to, exactly, but finding herself doing it, lifting things out one at a time and setting them in the grass in the order she found them. Flour barrel first, light as a drum. Cast iron pot. Folded quilt she carried in both arms like a sleeping child. At the bottom, under the last crate, a wooden box the length of her forearm, dovetailed at the corners by hands that had taken real time with it, fitted with 2 small brass hinges and a hasp but no lock. She set it on the grass in the sunlight and did not open it. Not yet. She found other things in the other wagons. A whetstone in a shallow dish. A candle burned to a thumb's length. An open book that had weighted face down on its shoal, as though the reader had only stepped away between paragraphs. Small leather shoes. A child's wooden horse carved from pine, its painted eye worn away, one leg broken and repaired with a small iron pin driven crosswise through the break, the kind of repair a person does by lamplight after something is broken and before morning comes, so that whoever finds it next finds it whole. She held that small mended horse in her palm for a long time. The sun went behind the western timber and the meadow cooled toward pewter, and she sat on the tailgate of the first wagon with the dovetailed box on her knees, and looked at it without opening it, and sat with it for a long while in the falling dark. The brass hasp had gone green with years and moved stiffly under her thumb. It gave at last with a small dry click that seemed to belong to the silence rather than to break it. She raised the lid. Inside, a folded square of oilcloth. Inside the oilcloth, a ledger, its cover darkened at the corners where many hands had held it. Beneath the ledger, a bundle of letters tied with a length of linen tape that had once been white, and was now the gray of everything else this mountain kept. She took the ledger out first, because the letters felt like a door she had no right yet to open, and a ledger felt like a record, and a record was a thing she was permitted to read. She opened the cover. On the first page, in a careful sloping hand, a list of names. 18 of them. 2 men in their 40s, their wives. A young man of 22 noted separately at the end of the list under his own line, set apart as though he belonged to no family, and to all of them at once. An outrider hired on at the last settlement to earn his passage west. She already knew whose initials would appear beside that last entry before her eyes found them. She knew the way she had known the knot before the knowing was finished, before the proof was complete, in the body before the mind. She found them anyway. Read them once, read them twice. And then the weight of the second reading came down on her, slow and total, and she sat on the tailgate in the failing light, with her father's younger self written plain in a stranger's careful hand, 22 and nameless to the world. Riding west to earn his way, noted down by a woman who had recognized something in him worth recording, worth the space on the page, worth the specificity of that separate line. A boy she had never met, would now never stop meeting. The first cold drop of rain struck the back of her neck. She looked up. The stars were gone while she had been sitting with the ledger. A wall of cloud had come up over the western timber and now lay flat and heavy along its bottom edge, and torn ragged at its top, exactly as Amos Red had drawn it for her in the air of his shop, exactly in the shape he had told her not to argue with. She moved. She wrapped the ledger and the letters in their oilcloth and shut them into the dovetailed box and carried it into the first wagon and set it under the folded quilt where it would stay dry. She lashed the torn canvas of the first wagon down over its bows, working by feel in the failing light, rain coming harder now, cold and slanting, and the mare wheeled and called after her from the picket. She ran to Juniper, loosed the line, led her in against the lee side of the third wagon, where the propped tongue made a low sheltering angle, threw the saddle blanket over the horse's withers, tied the lead short. Then she went back for the rest, armload after armload, the quilts and the felt hat and the small wooden horse, carrying them into the covered beds ahead of the rain and hauling the canvas down and making it fast, moving through the dark and the wet with the wind pulling at her coat and the cold rain running off her hat brim and down inside her collar. She was bent to the last knot on the fourth wagon, her cold fingers fumbling the wet rope when she heard it under the wind, a voice, low, broken, human, calling something she could not make out from somewhere past the open arc of the wagons, somewhere out in the streaming dark where the door had been left standing open for 25 years. She froze with her hand on the rope. The rain came down. The voice came again, closer, and this time she was certain of the word it carried, help. She dropped the rope and went toward the voice, not away from it. The choosing of that direction was the first thing she had done since she rode into this meadow that felt entirely her own. The man in the grass was on his knees. That was what she saw first, not his face, not the shape of the second person against his chest, but the posture of him. A big man reduced to his knees in the streaming dark, the kind of kneeling that has nothing to do with prayer and everything to do with the point at which the body decides it has spent everything it had and will not pretend otherwise. He'd come up the eastern trail she had ridden and fallen in the last yards of it, and he knelt now with his head bowed and his shoulders moving with the particular heave of a man who has been holding something together through will alone and has just run out of will. Against his chest, under the sodden wing of his canvas duster, he held a shape wrapped in a blanket that had stopped being dry a long time ago. The shape stirred, turned its face into the collar of the man's coat and made a sound, one sound, small and exhausted, the sound of someone who is frightened and tired, and not yet beyond either of those things, which told Nora more than any word could have. Beyond frightened, beyond tired. That was the threshold she'd been afraid of. This was not that. She reached them and went to her knees in the mud without a thought for the wool of her skirt or the cold water soaking through to her skin, because that calculation was no longer available to her. It had been replaced by a simpler one. The man lifted his face to her. Rain ran off the brim of his hat in a steady pour, off his beard in a thread. His lip was split at the corner and crusted dark. His eyes were red-rimmed and open too wide in the way eyes open when the body has been running on alarm for so long that it no longer knows how to dial it back. He was 44 years old and looked older than that tonight, in the way that a single terrible night can age a man past everything the calendar says about him. My wife. The words came through chattering teeth, broken apart by cold. Back down the trail. Her leg. The shale it gave under her. Nora did not waste breath on questions the dark could not answer. She got her arm under the person in the blanket, and the weight came away from the man without resistance. Owen Marsh. She didn't know his name yet, but she filed the shape of him, the work-worn canvas duster, the hat soaked shapeless, the hands that had been gripping that wrapped figure for however many miles of dark trail for later, because later was when names would matter. Right now what mattered was that the person she was lifting weighed less than she'd expected, and the breathing she could feel against her collar was quick and shallow but even, chilled, not in danger yet. But the margin between not yet and too late had been narrowing the whole time she'd been reading the ledger by failing light in a dry wagon, while this family had been on the trail behind her. She stood with the young man against her chest, Wade Marsh, 19 years old, though she did not know that either, and turned her shoulder to break the wind from his face and got her first clear look at him. His eyes were open. Dark. He watched her with the flat, unfocused calm of someone who has passed through the worst of the fear and come out on the other side into a strange floating exhaustion, where the world still registers but no longer requires response. "Can you walk?" She had already caught his father under the elbow with her free hand before the answer came, hauling upward, because there was no version of this night in which Owen Marsh could not walk, and they both understood that without having to say it. A man who can only carry one person carries the one who cannot be left. He had brought her the one who could tell her where to find the other. Owen came up in stages, the rising of a man whose legs have been working past their limit for hours, and have not yet been informed they are allowed to stop. He stood swaying in the rain and nodded once. She got them both to the third wagon, where Juniper stood in the lee with rain roping down her flanks, and she set Wade inside on the driest of the quilts she'd carried in ahead of the weather. She peeled the soaked blanket off him, cold wool, heavy with water, clinging, and wrapped him instead in the dry wool, tucking it close under his chin. She looked around for something for his head, and her eyes found the felt hat, the smoke-gray hat that had been hanging from its hook in her father's wagon since 1861, which she had taken down and carried in out of the rain not an hour ago without knowing why, only knowing that the rain should not get at it. She took it now and set it over Wade's wet hair, and it settled low on his forehead and swallowed his ears, and the brim came down nearly to the bridge of his nose. Under the drooping brim his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, the ghost of the memory of one, in a face that had used up its capacity for smiling sometime during the hours on the trail, and had not yet found it again. But it was there, and it was enough. "You're out of the weather now." She kept her voice low and even, the register she used with Juniper when the mare was on the edge of bolting, not because she thought Wade would bolt, but because the tone itself was what was needed, a sound that said the world was still organized even when it didn't feel that way. "You're inside." Owen had followed her in and stood dripping with his hands at his sides, staring at his son with the expression of a man who does not yet trust himself to believe the thing in front of him is real and will stay real. Nora put a hand flat on his back and pointed him toward the quilt. "Sit with him. Keep him against you. Share what heat you've got." She was already at the mare, pulling the cinch. "How far?" The saddle came free and she let it drop, the weight of it, the damp leather smell of it hitting the boards and settling. No time for proper stowage. Owen's voice came from behind her, cracked across the middle of it. "A mile, less maybe. There's a place the trail goes out onto bare shale, wide shelf of it. Nothing to hold on to." He stopped, started again. "She's below the edge, in the trees where the slope let her down. I couldn't carry her and Wade both. You chose right." She had a fistful of Juniper's mane and she said it without turning, because it was true and it was the only useful thing she could give him in the next 30 seconds. A man who can only carry one carries the one who can't tell you where to find the other. "Now keep that boy warm. Don't move from this wagon, whatever you hear. He needs you dry and still." Owen's voice broke open the rest of the way. She heard him gather himself, press it back, hold it, the sound a man makes when he is refusing to come apart in front of his son. He nodded, though she wasn't looking. She swung up onto Juniper's bare back with the lead rope wound once around her fist, pointed the mare's nose down the eastern trail, and went into the dark and the rain. Down the very road her father had ridden 25 years before, in a different season but the same dark, with the same need pulling him and the same mountain closing around the effort. She let the thought touch her and then let it go, because there was no room in her for anything but the trail and the mare and the pace that was fast enough to matter and slow enough not to kill them both on the descent. Juniper went down carefully. The trail ran with water, every old rut a small creek now, every flat stone a potential slide. The timber pressed close on both sides, and twice the mare checked hard and planted all 4 feet and refused, and both times Nora let her. Because a horse that stops on a mountain at night is not being obstinate. She is being right. She has read something her rider hasn't read yet, and the correct response is to believe her. Where Juniper refused, Nora found the trail had collapsed into a wash or dropped away over an edge that the rain had made invisible. She turned the horse and picked a longer way around both times and lost minutes she could feel losing, the way you feel a wound before you see it. She told herself Elsa Marsh had lasted this long and would last the time it took to do this right. The smell reached her before the sight, a flat mineral quality in the wet air, the smell of wet stone and altitude with the tree smell stripped away. Then the timber thinned and opened, and the trail ran out onto a long pale shelf of broken rock that held its own faint luminescence in the dark, the gray of shale asserting itself against the surrounding black. She drew Juniper up at the edge of it. The shale sloped away to her left, down and down a whole hillside of loose plate, treacherous even in dry weather, deadly now with rain. Somewhere below its lip, in the black tangle of the trees that had caught what the slope had let go, was a woman with a broken leg who had been lying in the wet dark since the light went out. Nora got down and left the mare standing. She went out onto the shale on foot. Each stone before she trusted it, the loose rock shifting and clattering beneath her boots, pieces of it skating away into the darkness below, with a sound that carried farther than it should have in the rain. She went to her knees where the slope steepened and worked her way down with her hands and her boot toes, calling into the rain, and the rain took her voice and did not give it back. She called again, called a third time, and was drawing breath for a fourth when a sound came up from below. Thin, spent, more breath than word. Here. Nora followed it down over the last of the shale to where the broken rock spilled into a stand of stunted pine at the slope's foot, and there was Elsa Marsh, 39 years old, propped against the largest trunk with one hand locked white-knuckled around a root that had pushed up out of the bank, the mountain's own hand, offered in the absence of any other. Her leg was turned wrong below the knee, in a way that made Nora's stomach register before her professional assessment could. Her face in the dark was drawn and pale and sheened with rain and exertion and the particular gray of sustained pain. But her eyes, when they found Nora's face, were present and clear. The first thing Elsa said before her name, before her pain, before any account of the hours she had spent on this slope was, "My boy. Did he? He's warm and dry with your husband in a wagon a mile above us." Nora knelt in the wet needles and laid her hand over Elsa's hand where it gripped the root, and felt the fingers cold, rigid, locked in the reflex of survival spasm once, and then begin, slowly, to release. The terrible tension of a woman who has been holding herself together around the single fact of her son's safety, letting go by degrees now that the fact had been confirmed. He even managed something close to a smile at me. Elsa's breath went out of her in a long shudder that was not quite a sob, the sound a body makes when it is finally allowed to feel how much it has borne without the additional weight of fear. Her free hand came up and pressed against her mouth. Elsa, she got the name out through her teeth. "I'm Elsa, Nora." She was already running her hands down the broken leg as gently as she could manage, reading the wrongness through the wet wool of Elsa's skirt, feeling for the break with the knowledge her father's hands had put into hers over years of lamplight, and the smell of liniment and the low steady voice he'd used when setting bone that was meant to be a floor for the other person to stand on while they went through the worst of it. The break was clean, below the knee. The bone was turned but not through the skin. A bad thing. Not the worst thing. "This is going to hurt," Nora said. "I'm not going to tell you otherwise." "Then don't." Elsa found something dry and iron-hard, underneath the pain, underneath the cold and the hours and the fear, something that had probably always been in her, and would probably always be in her. The mineral core of a woman who has learned that the gap between what she can bear and what she has to bear is navigable if she stops measuring it. Just do it. Nora cut a straight branch from the nearest stunted pine with the knife at her belt and stripped it clean, and cut a second. And she tore the lower tail of her own flannel shirt into strips with her teeth and her hands, working in the dark and the rain by touch alone. She set the leg the way her father had set the colt's cannon bone when she was 11 years old and had held the lamp and watched his hands move with a sureness that had nothing to do with confidence and everything to do with practice. She talked the whole time she worked. Not about the leg. She talked about Wade and the hat, the smoke-gray felt hat that had been hanging in the second wagon since before either of them was born, which had descended over his ears and his nose when she put it on him, and the way his face had moved despite everything, the twitch of humor that a body produces involuntarily when something is genuinely a little bit absurd. She talked about Owen standing over him with that expression that was equal parts relief and disbelief, and how she'd had to put her hand on his back and aim him at the quilt because his legs weren't sure what to do with the absence of crisis. Elsa held on to the sound of it, her jaw locked. Her eyes streamed from the pain, from the cold, from the accumulated weight of the night. She made no sound she could help until it was splinted. until the binding was tied and the worst of it was behind them. Getting up the shale was not something that could be described as a plan, so much as a sustained argument with gravity made by two women who had decided not to lose it. Nora went up first with the mare's lead rope paid out behind her, found the largest pine at the top of the shale field and tied off to it, then came back down. She got Elsa to her one good foot and put her shoulder under Elsa's arm, and the rope was the third thing between them and the slope, and they went up a body length at a time, resting between, the shale sliding out and reforming, the rain continuous and indifferent to the effort being made in it. By the time they reached the top, both women were shaking and slick with mud to the elbows. Elsa had gone somewhere past speech, somewhere that was still present, still holding on, but no longer had surplus for words. When Nora boosted her across Juniper's withers and then eased her upright to sit, Elsa's hand went into the wet mane and stayed there. They came up the trail slower than Nora had gone down it. The mare bore the extra weight with her ears flat and her head low, choosing her footing in the dark with the same unhurried reliability she had brought to every mile of this journey. Nora walked at her shoulder with one hand on the lead rope and one hand on Elsa's knee to steady her around the switchbacks. And neither woman had anything left to put into speech, so neither of them tried. The meadow opened above them at last, gray-black under the streaming sky, and from the third wagon a voice came that was too ragged with relief to be called a cry, and too human to be called anything else. Owen Marsh's voice, recognizing the shape of his wife on horseback even through dark and rain, coming out of him before he'd decided to make a sound. Nora got Elsa down and into the wagon beside her husband and her son, and the three of them folded together in the particular silence of a family that has just survived something it didn't know it could survive, and is still in the process of understanding that it did. She turned away, gave them the only privacy the meadow could offer, which was her back and the darkness and the sound of rain on canvas to cover whatever they needed to say. She built the meadow's first fire in 25 years, small and careful under the overhang of the third wagon's tailgate, where the wind couldn't find it and the rain couldn't reach it. She fed it with the driest pieces she could find by feel, the splintered slat, the end of a broken bow, and when it caught, she fed it larger pieces slowly, the way you feed anything that needs time to become reliable. She found the tin coffee pot that had stood on the driver's seat of the first wagon since before she was born, and she boiled water in it, and she warmed strips of dried venison in the hot water until the meat softened, and she fed it to Wade in small pieces with the broth while he sat wrapped in the quilt with the smoke-gray hat still on his head. The color came back into him. The shaking stopped. She checked the splint by firelight and rebounded with 2 lengths of rope and pieces of a broken bow, and Elsa lay still and let her work with a steadiness that had cost something to find and maintain. "You do that like you've done it before," Elsa said, keeping her voice low so as not to disturb Wade, who had fallen into the flat, exhausted sleep of someone whose body has called the last of the debt. "My father set bone." I held the lamp. Nora tied off the last binding and sat back on her heels. The fire threw warm light up under the tailgate and turned the wagon's underside amber. He used to say a splint that hurts is a splint that's holding. I'm sorry to say yours is holding very well. The corner of Elsa's mouth moved. Not a smile exactly, but the acknowledgement of one. Useful thing to inherit. Owen had gone quiet across the fire, and now he spoke into it in the voice of a man who has found the solid ground under the night's terror and is testing his weight on it. "Owen Marsh, that's my wife you hauled up a mile of black shale, and that's my son you found a hat for." He lifted his eyes from the fire, and they were wet, and not only from the rain. "We came up from the Fork settlement. Man in the low country told me this road cut half a week off the Kettle Valley crossing. Said folks avoided it from old superstition and nothing more." Nora's hands went still on the coffee pot. A man in the low country, well-dressed, speaking of this road with the easy certainty of someone who knew its reputation well enough to explain it away, which was a very particular kind of knowing. She set the pot on the coals with more care than it needed. Did he describe himself? Didn't have to, much. One of those men who fills a room. Owen looked at her across the fire with the new attention of someone who has just registered that her stillness has meaning. "You know him?" "I might." She weighed the question and the answer, and what she could responsibly do with either. She had no proof of what she was beginning to think, only the cold shape of a suspicion taking form in the part of her mind that her father had also given her, the part that filed things away whole and let them sit until they were ready to be understood. A well-dressed man in the low country who knew the Ridge Road's reputation well enough to diffuse it. Who had told her before a full table that the mountain would keep her. Who had, it now appeared, told a frightened family the same road was sound. "I might," she said again, "but I won't say his name tonight. Not without proof. Not to a man who can't do anything with a suspicion except carry it on top of everything else he's already carrying." Owen looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded and looked back at his son, and the nod contained the trust of a man who has already given his family's safety to a stranger once tonight, and found that trust well placed. She did not sleep. She kept the fire, fed it through the night in the careful way, and she sat with her back against the wagon wheel, and the ledger in her lap, not reading it, just holding it. Her father's name at the bottom of the first page. The word that preceded the name, outrider. The age, 22. She had known him as all ages at once. The way you know a parent, the timeless composite of every version you've seen. From the man who held her on his boot, to the man who went quiet in the lamplight, to the man who could not go back to somewhere. She had not known the version that was 22 and riding west to earn his passage and hired on with strangers who turned out to need him more than anyone had understood when they offered him the job. That version of him felt very close tonight. That version had stood at this meadow's edge, had looked at these wagons, had made a decision and ridden east in the dark, and she had just ridden that same trail in the other direction, and come back with 2 more people breathing than when she went. The storm broke before dawn. It went the way mountain storms go all at once. The cloud tearing in the east, the rain stopping between one breath and the next, and the silence that came down was so complete that it woke her where she sat against the wheel. The timber steamed. The meadow lay soaked and glittering, every blade of grass strung with water, and the 6 wagons stood dark and dripping and whole, the lashings she had fought into place through the storm all holding. She went out alone in the wet dawn to walk the arc. Everything had held. The braced tongues, the repaired bows, the tied canvas. At the 5th wagon, the one she hadn't reached before the weather came, the storm had found the old rotted seam and the canvas had split and folded back, and the rain had gotten in. She climbed up to see the damage and expected flour dust and ruined cloth. What she found instead, laid bare where the driving rain had washed a quarter-century of dust off it, was a second box. Not dovetailed and fine like the one from the first wagon. A plain tin document box, the kind sold in dry goods stores for keeping papers safe from damp, the kind that cost almost nothing, and was chosen not for beauty but for function. Its lid was rusted but sound. It had been wedged down low against the sideboard under a false floor of loose planking, and the storm had knocked the planking askew and exposed it. Someone had hidden it. Someone had gone to the trouble of concealment, not simply packed it, not simply set it with the other cargo, but specifically and deliberately hidden it from any casual hand that might sort through the wagon's contents. Nora knelt in the wet wagon bed and worked the lid up, and the rust shrieked and gave. Inside, dry beneath a wrapping of waxed paper, lay a sheaf of documents in a hand she recognized from the ledger. The same careful sloping script. She lifted the topmost page into the gray morning light and read it. The cold that had been sitting in her since Owen Marsh, said man in the low country, spread upward through her chest and closed around her heart like a hand. It was a land claim. Filed and witnessed and stamped for the whole of the high meadow, and the water that fed it the creek she had drunk from twice, the watershed that made the grass grow thick enough to winter a herd. Entered in the names of the 2 families of the wagon train, dated in the spring of 1861, a full and legal claim to the very ground she was kneeling on, made by the very people whose names the town below had spent 25 years calling a ghost story told over coffee. These people had not been passing through. They had not been wandering. They had been coming home to a place that was already, in the eyes of the law, theirs. They had filed on this land and gone east to gather the last of their kin and their goods, and they had been bringing the whole of 2 families up to a meadow that belonged to them, and something had happened on the way up that had left 6 wagons in an open arc and 18 people somewhere else and 1 man riding down in the dark to get help that never came. Beneath the claim, page under page, the filing receipt from the Territorial Land Office, the survey lines drawn in the same brown ink as Amos Redd's scrap of hide, a letter of intent to establish a stock ranch on the Kettle Meadow water. She sat back on her heels in the wet and understood, all at once, why a well-dressed man in the low country might send stranger after stranger up a road that killed its reputation, not from cruelty for its own sake. not from carelessness. A meadow with a standing claim could not be sold. But a meadow whose claimants had vanished, whose heirs had never come forward, whose very existence had curdled into a joke. Told over dinner was a meadow that a patient man might one day file on as abandoned empty ground and sell to whoever came asking. And someone was asking. A railroad survey, she didn't know that yet, but the shape of it was forming the patience of it, the deliberateness, the fact that a man like Edmund Hale would go to the trouble of sending travelers up a road he knew was dangerous, rather than simply leaving the road alone and letting time do the work. Time was not working fast enough for something. She wrapped the documents back in their waxed paper and carried the tin box to the first wagon and set it beside the dovetailed one under the quilt. The record of who these people were and the proof of what was theirs, together, where she could put her hand on both. Then she went back to the fire and built it up because the Marsh family would wake cold, and the morning had work in it. They spent 2 days in the meadow, which was not the plan, but became the plan, because Elsa could not travel without something to travel on, and there was nothing yet to travel on, and the mare needed rest before she bore a burden down that trail. And because, though no one said this directly, the place had begun to do something to all of them. The strange-held quality of it settling even into Owen, who had arrived with the face of a man who has seen the far end of everything he had, and who, by the second morning, was moving through the meadow with something that was not quite ease, but was its approximation. He proved good with wood once his hands stopped shaking, and he and Nora built a travois from the slats of the storm-opened fifth wagon, a long triangular drag the mare could pull. Padded with quilts, the splinted leg braced straight across it. Wade helped where he could. He had recovered quickly, the way 19-year-old bodies recover from cold and fear, when given food and warmth and sufficient sleep, and he was the kind of young man who recovers into curiosity rather than into stillness. He followed Nora around the meadow the way young people follow someone they have decided is interesting, into the wagons along the creek, out to the picket where juniper grazed in the thin autumn grass. He had questions, many of them, about the wagons, about the knots, about the names in the ledger when she showed him the first page, about how a person read a hill for water. She answered all of them, and found that it did not tire her the way she would have expected. It was Wade who found the last thing. He found it the way young people find things, which is by going somewhere an adult wouldn't bother looking. He had climbed up into the second wagon, her father's wagon, the one with the hitch and the carved initials, drawn by the smoke-gray hat's twin, that still hung from the forward hook. He had wormed himself into the narrow space behind the seat, where only someone his size and age and impervious to discomfort could comfortably fit, and he came back out with dust on his nose and a flat packet in his hand, which he brought to Nora, with the casual triumph of the young. "There's a hiding place under the seatboard." He held it out. "My hiding place at home has my good penknife in it. This one had this." Nora took the packet, oilcloth, the same gray tape as the letters in the dovetailed box, and when she weighed it in her palm, she felt through the wrapping the particular give of paper folded many times. The slight stiffness of ink dried into it. She thanked Wade with the gravity the discovery deserved. She told him it was a fine piece of finding. She sent him off to report the hiding place to his father. And when he had gone, she sat down on the tailgate of the second wagon, with the packet in her lap and her heart working with a speed and force that had nothing to do with the morning's physical labor, because she knew the way she had known the knot, the way she had known the initials, before she read them what this packet was. She untied the tape. Inside were letters, in her father's hand. She knew his handwriting the way she knew his hitch. She had watched it all her life, the feed accounts, the lease papers, the scrap of paper he kept in his Bible on which once a year on the same date he wrote a woman's name that she had never asked about. Here was that same hand, younger, the letters standing straighter, less worn down by years, but unmistakably his. And the topmost letter had no address, no salutation. It began, without preamble, the way a person writes when the words will not stay inside any longer, and there is no one left to hear them. She read the first lines. The meadow went away from her. The steaming grass, and the sound of Owen working somewhere with the hatchet, and Wade's voice asking something of his mother, all of it went away, and there was only her father's young hand on the page, telling her at last, and in his own words, the thing he had carried down this mountain, and never once been able to speak. He had ridden down for help. She had pieced that together from the ledger. But the letter went on past the ledger's last page, down the trail with him, all the way to the bottom of the mountain, and into the low country where he had gone to the settlement and to the land office both, and told them what he had on the mountain families, sick ones, children on the mend, a road that was closing with snow and been turned away, not from cruelty, from doubt. A boy of 22 half dead on a foundered horse, speaking of a wagon train up a road that everyone knew was impassable, claiming a filed land claim that the clerk could find no record of, because the claim had been filed, and then the record had been buried. The filing had been made and witnessed and stamped, but the entry had been pulled from the territorial register afterward, pulled and altered by a clerk who wanted the meadow for himself and knew that vanished claimants filed no complaint. Her father had gathered what help he could beg alone and ridden back up as far as the pass, and 2 days later, when the storm cleared, he had come back to the meadow and found it empty. 6 wagons. No people. No sign of which direction 18 souls had gone. No way for a 22-year-old man to know whether they had found another way down or were still above him somewhere in the snow. He had feared the worst. The letter said this plainly, in a hand that pressed hard enough in places to almost tear the paper. He had believed he had failed them. Believed it for the rest of his life. The letter told her why he could never say it, not because the words weren't there, but because a man does not sit his daughter on his boot and tell her that he believes himself responsible for the loss of 18 people who trusted him to bring back help when he brought back nothing. A man does not say that, and then go on being the person who mends her toys by lamplight and checks the fence line and talks to the horse in the early morning when he thinks no one can hear. He carries it instead. He carries it down into the ordinary days and learns to walk with the weight of it so well that no one can see it's there. Not even the daughter who watches him most closely. Not even her. He had come back once. The letter said so. In the spring after Nora was born, alone, he had climbed up here one final time. He had made the dovetailed box by hand over that winter and carried it up and set the ledger inside it and hidden it, where someone might find it, not the kind of hiding meant to conceal forever, but the kind meant to preserve for the right moment, the right person. He had known he could not do the rest himself. The clerk who had buried the filing had risen since then into something else, money, standing, a wide, smooth face that towns learn to trust, because it has been there long enough and has never cost them anything directly. Too dangerous for a man already broken by guilt, already certain his word would be disbelieved. But the letter's last lines were written in a hand that had gone suddenly steady, as though the act of writing them had given him back something he had been losing for 25 years. Someone will come who was not there to fail, someone who did not run to save herself and did not stay to grieve, and she will be the one to bring them home. I have left the door open on the east. Nora set the page down in her lap and pressed both palms flat on it and looked out at the 6 wagons standing in the meadow's morning light, and the open eastern arc between them, and the trail that ran east and down toward Garnet Bend and Edmund Hale, and everything that waited below. She understood the whole shape of it now. Not the grief. That was too large to understand all at once. The grief of knowing her father had carried a wound that was not his for the length of her entire life. That he had looked up at this ridge from the porch after supper, not from habit but from the specific ache of something unfinished. He had not been able to finish and had not been able to walk away from. That would come later, in pieces, over time. What she understood now was the shape of what she had to do with it. She had not come up this mountain to mourn. She had come up because she had nothing left the world could take from her, and she had found out, sitting on the tailgate of her father's wagon with his letter in her hands, that this was a different kind of freedom than she had thought. Not the freedom of having nothing to lose. The freedom of having something to carry that was, finally, the right weight for her particular kind of strength. She folded the letter along its old creases and held it against her chest. And across the meadow, the sound of Owen's hatchet rang steady against the last of the travois poles. And Elsa called something from the 3rd wagon, and Wade answered from somewhere near the creek the sound of a family continuing its living in the middle of all that long-kept stillness. The first voices this meadow had contained in 25 years, and the meadow held them the way it held everything else, not lost, kept. She rose from the tailgate and went to help with the travois, because the work was waiting, and the work was how she got herself down the mountain and into the fight that was waiting for her at the bottom, and she was ready for that fight now, in a way she had not been 2 days ago when she rode up. She had come up a girl with nothing left. She was going down an heir with proof. And the difference between those two things was about to matter very much to a well-dressed man who had spent 25 years making sure no one ever came down off this ridge to tell him so. The shale slope in daylight was a different animal than it had been in the rain and the dark. Nora had known this was coming. She'd known it the moment the storm broke, and she went out into the wet dawn to check the lashings and looked south toward the trail and thought, with the particular clarity that follows a sleepless night, that what she had managed in the dark by instinct and desperation was going to look considerably worse in the light. She had been right. The whole hillside of loose gray plate lay canted at an angle that made the stomach register. Before the mind did a long pale scar on the mountain's face, raw and indifferent, and cut across it fresh and dark was the track of the slide that had taken Elsa Marsh down. That track had not been there before the storm. The rain had moved things. The mountain had reshuffled. She stood at the top of it with the travois behind her, and Juniper at her shoulder, and Owen on the far side of the mare, and she looked at the crossing they had to make, and she calculated it without speaking, because there was nothing useful to say about it. The crossing was what it was. The doing of it was what remained. She unhooked the travois. Understood without being told she had noticed this about him, across 2 days in the meadow, that he was a man who watched what needed doing and moved toward it without requiring direction, the kind of man whose usefulness sharpens rather than dulls under pressure. He took the empty drag and held it on the upper side while she led Juniper across alone. One careful step at a time. The mare's ears flat, her nostrils reading each stone before her hoof committed to it, her body angled slightly into the slope the way a horse angles into wind, not fighting it, using it for information. 3 stones gave way under them and rattled down into the drop below, and were swallowed by the distance, and Nora kept moving because stopping on a sliding surface is worse than continuing. And she had learned that from Juniper rather than from any person they came across. She tied the mare to the one anchored thing on the far side, a juniper root that had pushed through the rock face, and held and went back for Elsa. Elsa had been watching from the travois with the particular attention of a woman who has decided that the only useful thing she can contribute to this crossing is to not add to the difficulty of it by being frightened in a way that shows. She had the steady look of someone managing a very large feeling in a very small internal space. When Nora came back for her, she said nothing. She put her hands where Nora indicated, shifted her weight when Nora told her to, and trusted the movement to Nora's judgment the way a person trusts a ferry across a river they can see is running high, not without reservation, but with the understanding that the reservation is not going to help them get across. Owen and Wade handled the empty travois on the return trip, and Nora walked beside Elsa on the mare, one hand on the lead rope and one hand on Elsa's knee at each uncertain step, and the whole crossing cost them the better part of an hour and soaked Nora's shirt through with the kind of sweat that comes from sustained concentration rather than exertion. When they reached the far side, and she rehooked the travois and checked the lashings and stood up straight, the back of her neck ached in a way that told her she'd been holding her head at the wrong angle for the entire crossing. Worth it. All of it worth it. Below the shale, the trail gentled. The character of the country changed degree by degree as they descended the high alpine, giving way to mixed pine and aspen, the cold thinning from a blade to something merely brisk, the smell of the mountain softening as lower altitude vegetation began to contribute its own vocabulary. Nora walked at Juniper's head the whole length of the descent, choosing each step for the horse the way the horse had chosen each step for her on the way up. It seemed right to her, the reciprocity of it. Owen walked behind the travois. Wade walked beside his mother, and he had found somewhere in the 2 days on the mountain, perhaps in the long hours of the first night, perhaps in the meadow's particular quality of stillness, that settled into a person whether they wanted it to or not, a quieter version of himself than the one who had peppered Nora with questions at the creek. He was still present, still watchful, but the questions had gone internal. He was thinking something through. She could see it in the set of his shoulders and the way he periodically glanced at the wagon track below and then back up at the mountain behind them. He came level with her once, midway down the long grade, and walked beside her for a while in silence before he said, low enough that only she could hear it, "That man, he told my father the road was sound. You know him." It was not a question. He had been 18 hours awake with nothing to do but listen and observe, and he was 19 and not slow. Yes, and he sent us up knowing. I believe so. A pause. The trail bent and they bent with it. What are you going to do about it? She looked at him sideways, at the young face that still had the last of its roundness, but was making its way toward the plains it would carry for the next 40 years. I'm going to go into that town and say what I know where the whole town can hear it, and then I'm going to put the papers I found on a land office counter and let the record speak. He thought about this for 2 or 3 steps. What if the record's been tampered with? Then that becomes part of what I say. She kept her eyes on the trail ahead. A thing done in the open street in front of witnesses is harder to bury than a thing done in a quiet room. That's the only advantage I have, so I intend to use it. He nodded slowly, and it was the nod of someone filing information rather than agreeing with a conclusion, and she liked him for it. They reached the large fork where the old ridge road rejoined the main wagon track in the early afternoon, and she stopped them there to rest the mare and let Elsa's leg ease. The track ran down and southwest toward Garnet Bend, and Nora stood a little apart from the others, and looked along it toward the town she had ridden out of 9 days ago, and she was aware, in the specific way you are aware of a change in your own body, that she was not the same person who had ridden out. She had gone up a woman with nothing left. She was coming down an air with proof lashed in oilcloth behind the saddle. The difference between those two things was legal and factual and real. What she did not yet know was whether it would be enough, whether the proof was strong enough to survive a man who had spent 25 years making sure this proof was never found, and who had had 25 years to build the kind of standing that can turn a town's gaze away from an inconvenient truth. She knew the fear was reasonable. She carried it down the last grade without pretending it wasn't there. They came into Garnet Bend in the middle of the afternoon, which was exactly when she had wanted to arrive. Not at dusk when people were indoors and inattentive. Not at dawn when the street was empty. The full flat light of mid-afternoon when Garnet Bend's main street was as populated as it ever got: the feed store, the dry goods merchant, the livery, the Cornerstone Hotel at the far end standing over everything, with the mild authority of a building that has been the most important structure on the block, long enough to have stopped needing to prove it. Garnet Bend saw them before they reached the first buildings. A woman leading a mare with a travois was a thing that drew eyes at any time. A woman leading a mare with a travois who was wearing a torn flannel shirt and boots caked with mountain mud, with a family aboard and 2 wooden boxes strapped behind the saddle. That was something that drew people out of doorways. She could feel the street orienting toward them as they came. The weight of observation, the town reorganizing its attention. She did not look at the Cornerstone until she was 3 doors from it. When she did, he was there, Edmund Hale, standing on the hotel's covered porch with a coffee cup in his right hand, which had rested somewhere between the saucer and his mouth, and stopped there as though the mechanism that operated it had briefly seized. He was dressed as he was always dressed: the black wool vest, the white collar, the watch chain catching the afternoon light. From this distance his face was unreadable, but the coffee cup had not moved. She looked away from him, stopped the mare in front of the 2-story building where a single hand-lettered shingle identified the occupant as Wallace Pruitt, physician. She pitched her voice to the street rather than to any particular person, because the street was who she needed to hear it. This woman's leg is broken below the knee, clean and flat, no appeal in it. A statement of medical fact requiring response. She's been injured on Sunder Ridge and she needs attention. Pruitt came out in less than a minute, a spare gray man in his shirt sleeves, with the economical movements of someone who has been answering this kind of summons for decades and has refined the response to its essentials. He came down from his porch and went directly to the travois, and crouched beside Elsa and ran his hands along the splint with the focused attention of a man reading something in Braille. He tested the binding at 3 points. He pressed carefully above and below the break. He stood up and looked at Nora across the mare. Who set this? I did. He looked at her, really looked. Not the reflexive looking that people do when they glance at a person they've already categorized, but the actual looking that happens when a category turns out to be wrong. Your father set bone? I held the lamp. She had unstrapped the travois hooks and was easing the drag down, keeping Elsa's leg level. He used to say the main thing was to keep talking so the patient had something to hold on to besides the pain. Pruitt crouched again and examined the lower binding. He grunted the professional grunt that is a species of compliment from men who don't give them freely. It'll hold. I've seen worse work from practitioners who charge for the service. He straightened and looked at her with that recalibrated attention. You brought them down off the ridge road. I did. Nobody comes down off the ridge road. He said it the way people said it in this part of the country, not as a personal observation but as a received fact, a regional truth as established as the water running downhill. The street had filled. Not all of it, not dramatically, but enough people who had been in doorways were now on steps. People who had been on steps were now at street level. The drover who had snorted into his cup at the long table, the woman with flour on her sleeve, a scatter of others whose faces she recognized from the kitchen and the dining room. The town was listening. She made sure what she said next went to all of it. People have been coming down off that ridge for 25 years. She kept her voice level and clear, without heat, because heat would let them dismiss her. The trouble is that somebody made sure they were never believed when they did. The sentence went through the crowd the way a stone goes through still water, not loudly, but with the geometry of a disturbance that keeps moving outward after the initial impact. She watched faces shift. Watched the change pass from person to person, the recalculation happening behind eyes she could see working. And on the Cornerstone's porch, Edmund Hale set his coffee cup down on the rail without appearing to notice that he'd done it. She turned from Pruitt's porch and walked up the street toward the hotel, toward the man. She was aware of the boxes behind the saddle, aware of the Marsh family at the doctor's porch, aware of the whole weight of the street at her back. She was also aware, with a steadiness that surprised her a little, that she was not afraid. She had expected fear, had expected the version of herself that had stood outside the livery 3 weeks ago with shaking hands to reassert itself now when the stakes were real. Instead, there was something that felt more like clarity. The fear had been present when the outcome was uncertain. The outcome was still uncertain, but she had the proof in her saddlebag, and she was about to speak, and whatever Hale did after she spoke was his problem in a way that it had not been her father's problem 25 years ago, when a 22-year-old outrider had come down this same mountain with nothing but his word and his exhaustion. She stopped at the foot of the porch steps and looked up at him. You told the county over supper that the mountain would keep me. She did not raise her voice. The street was quiet enough that she did not need to. You seemed very certain of it. Hale recovered himself. She watched it happen, the smoothness sliding back down over whatever had cracked in the moment she appeared at the end of the street, settling back into place with the practiced ease of a man who has been managing his surface for decades. He came to the top of the steps and looked down at her and produced something that was designed to look like amusement and almost succeeded. I'm glad to be proven wrong. A young woman surviving a difficult journey is a fine thing. You've brought a family back alive. No one will begrudge you that. He spread his hands. Magnanimous. The wronged party demonstrating his generosity. The man of standing absolving the person of no standing of her presumptuousness. Though, and his voice dropped half a register, into the register of the reasonable, the sensible, the man who has everyone's best interests at heart. I'd think a week in that country would teach a person that there's nothing up there but rotten timber and old stories, and no cause for a sensible town to go stirring itself over either. There's a good deal up there. She did not move, did not adjust her weight, did not give him the small physical concession that people give to authority when authority reminds them of itself. 6 wagons still standing, 18 names still legible in a ledger, and a land claim filed and witnessed in the spring of 1861 for the whole of the Kettle Meadow water. She watched the word land claim go into him. Watched the small muscle jump at the corner of his jaw before he could still it, the involuntary tell of a man who has heard the specific word he has spent 25 years not hearing and has not yet arranged his face fast enough. I imagine you'd know something about a claim on that meadow, she continued, conversationally. A man in your position, with your interests in this county. Hale found his footing. She could hear it in the way his voice resettled the smoothness, coming back with the particular confidence of a man who has walked this ground before and knows its contours. A great many claims were filed in this territory in those years by people who never proved them up. The law has a name for such ground. He paused to let the word land. Abandoned, it reverts, it becomes available to men willing to improve it, of course. She kept her tone even. Whatever documentation exists from a party that never came forward has essentially no legal standing after 25 years of abandonment. Precisely. And here was the mistake. Here was the small window that opens when a practiced man believes he is in control of the conversation. Whatever moldering paperwork you found in a rotted wagon won't carry the weight of a dry leaf in any territorial proceeding. 25 years unproved, no heir ever presenting themselves, no complaint ever filed. And it certainly doesn't have the weight to obstruct a railroad survey. The street heard it. She let it sit for one full breath, let it land in the silence the way it needed to land. Let the people standing on the street find the sentence themselves and feel its shape. Then she said quietly enough that people had to listen harder. A railroad survey. Now, that's something I hadn't mentioned, Mr. Hale. She watched his jaw tighten. I said a claim and a meadow. You said a railroad. She kept looking at him steadily. A man only reaches for the reason something matters to him when he forgets, for the space of a breath, that the person across from him doesn't know it yet. The muscle in his jaw jumped again. This time, he did not recover it before the street could see it. It was then that she became aware of someone moving through the crowd, coming toward her from the left, unhurried, not pushing, simply placing himself into the space between her and the hotel steps, with the deliberateness of a man who has made a decision and is making good on it. She knew him by his size before she saw his face. She had noticed him in the Cornerstone dining room the morning she'd confronted Hale over the table, the man at the back corner, whose head required a certain angle of accommodation relative to the ceiling beam, who had been the only person in that room who did not find the moment amusing. She had not known his name then, Ben Calloway. She knew it now from 2 days of the Marsh family mentioning the name of the deputy marshal, who had come to Garnet Bend on unrelated business, and had apparently been asking questions about land filings in the northern part of the county in a way that had made at least 2 people in the dry goods store uncomfortable. He came to stand beside Amos Red at the foot of the porch steps. He did not look at her. He looked at Hale. He was wearing the vest with the marshal's star today, which he hadn't been in the dining room, and it caught the afternoon light with the dull pewter gleam of a thing that was not decorative. He was, she noted with the part of her mind that was cataloging everything about this moment for later use, substantially larger than she had registered from across a dining room. Not tall in the way of thin men who are simply tall. Large in the structural sense, the kind of size that changes the geometry of a space when it enters, that makes doorframes suddenly seem like they were designed for a smaller species. He stood with a stillness that was not the stillness of inaction but the stillness of a man who has learned that most situations resolve themselves faster if you don't add noise to them. Amos Red stood beside him, and the old wheelwright spoke first. In the mild, unhurried voice he used for everything, a voice that had been describing the world across a workbench for 40 years, and had arrived at a tone that was both pleasant and completely impossible to dismiss. I knew a land office clerk once. Over at the territorial seat, back when it was 2 streets and a courthouse tent. He appeared to be addressing the general air, the mild recollection of a man thinking out loud. Ambitious fellow, particular about paperwork. The kind who knew that a filing only exists as long as its record does. He turned his gray eyes up to Hale on the steps without hurrying. Face doesn't change as much as people think, Rutherford. Not to someone who's been looking at faces across a bench for 40 years. The silence that came down over the street then was not the silence of nothing happening. It was the silence of a great many people rearranging a story they had believed for a quarter of a century, fitting the new shape to the ghost story of the Ridge Road, to the reasonable, well-dressed man who had told them for decades that there was nothing up there worth the climb, and finding that the new shape fit better than the old one in the specific, uncomfortable way that true things fit. Hale's face had gone a bad color. That is slander. He said it low, and the smoothness was gone, not cracked but absent, replaced by something smaller and uglier underneath. The voice of a man who has been very powerful for a very long time and is encountering, perhaps for the first time, a situation that his power cannot simply reorganize. A filthy slander from a broken-down old man who resents every dollar he never earned. And I will not stand on my own porch and be accused by a mob stirred up by a disowned girl and then come down off your porch. She said it without raising her voice. Come down to the land office with me right now, in front of these people, and let Thomas Finch read the papers I found. If they're what you say they are, dry leaves, worthless scraps, then you have nothing to fear from them, and I'll have made a fool of myself in front of the whole town. She let that settle. But if they're what I say they are, then a great many people who trusted your word about that road deserve to hear what your word has been worth. He did not come down. Would you treat them with kindness? That was the thing the street would remember, afterward when they sorted through the afternoon and arranged it into the version they would carry forward. He had been given the chance to prove himself innocent in public, in front of witnesses, with the papers right there, and he had chosen to stay on his porch and call it beneath him. A guilty man given a clear exit will sometimes prefer the appearance of dignity to the reality of exoneration. Hale preferred it. He said it was beneath him. He said he would answer a slander in a court of law and not in a dusty street at the instigation of people who had already decided what they wanted to find. He went inside. The door of the Cornerstone Hotel closed behind him, and the street stood and looked at the closed door. The closed door, in the end, said more than any open one could have. Nora went to the land office that same afternoon, before her nerve could cool or the town's attention could disperse. She went with Amos Red beside her and the dovetailed box under her arm, and she laid her father's papers on the counter in front of Thomas Finch before the light in the single west-facing window had shifted more than a degree. Finch was 31 and precise, the kind of man who handled old paper by its edges and appeared physically uncomfortable with the idea of ink on his cuffs. He read the claim document twice. He read the filing receipt. He held the survey lines up to the window light and traced the boundaries with a clean fingernail, following the lines the way a reader follows a difficult sentence, making sure the meaning was what the words said it was. Then he set it all down with a careful horizontal motion, as though the papers were resting rather than being placed, and looked at Nora with the expression of someone who has just had something very large walk through a very ordinary door. This receipt carries a filing number. His voice was steady but effortful. Every filing number in the territorial system is entered in the master register in sequence the day it's made. If this receipt is genuine, there will be a corresponding entry at the territorial seat either matching this claim, or showing the number assigned to something else, or showing the number absent entirely. He paused. If the number is there but the claim it was entered for is not, if someone has altered what that number refers to, that alteration will be visible. The territorial register is a continuous document. You cannot remove an entry without leaving evidence of its removal. Amos, from beside her, unless you write over it rather than removing it. Finch looked at the wheelwright with the look of a man recognizing an inconvenient precision. Writing over it would also be visible under examination. The original ink doesn't disappear. It becomes subordinate, but it's there. He took a breath. I can write to the territorial recorder's office today. Request a certified copy of the register page corresponding to this filing number. The mail stage runs day after tomorrow. 2 weeks there and back, roughly. 2 weeks. Nora set her hand flat on the counter. 2 weeks was a long time when the person on the other side of the question was a man with 25 years of accumulated standing and the clear knowledge that the walls were closing. Finch read her expression. In 11 years keeping records, I have never seen a forged filing receipt. The reason is that a receipt only proves what it claims. If the register backs it, a receipt without a register entry is meaningless, so forging the receipt alone gains nothing. This either is what it appears to be, or it is the strangest, most useless forgery ever constructed. He squared the papers with both hands, a small unconscious gesture of respect for a document he had not yet decided was genuine, but was already treating as though it might be. I'll send the letter today. She left the land office with the certainty of a woman who has placed the only piece she has on the board correctly, and the colder certainty of a woman who knows she has just shown the other player exactly where it is. Ben Calloway was standing outside. He was leaning against the wall beside the land office door, in the way large men lean against things, not casually, because nothing about him was quite casual, but without the rigid uprightness he maintained when he was navigating crowds. He had removed his hat and was holding it at his side, and the late afternoon light fell across his face at the angle that made it easier to see the lines in it, the ones around his eyes, from years of squinting into open country, the one at the corner of his mouth that might be from smiling and might be from something else. He pushed off from the wall when she came out. You found land documents in those wagons. Not a question. He'd been in the street, he'd heard her. 2 sets of them. One in a dovetailed box in the first wagon. One in a hidden tin box in the 5th, under a false floor. She stopped and looked at him directly, because she had decided in the meadow that she did not have time for the roundabout approach, and he did not seem like a man who preferred it anyway. The tin box contained a filed land claim on the Kettle Meadow water, dated 1861. entered in the names of the two families of the wagon train. He was quiet for a moment, the silence of a man absorbing information rather than formulating a response to it. Hale has been attempting to file on that property for 3 years. Each time there's been a delay at the territorial office. He's attributed it to backlogs. She held his gaze. The filing was made in 1861. If the original entry still exists in the territorial register, it predates anything he's attempted to file by more than 20 years. And if the original entry doesn't exist, if someone altered or replaced it, that will show too. You sent for the register page. Finch sent for it this afternoon. Another silence. He put his hat back on, a single deliberate motion. The hinge of the thing, the moment in which two people who have been solving the same problem from different sides of it understand simultaneously that they have found each other at the problem's center, settled without either of them marking it. 14 days is a long time, he said. I know. He won't spend them quietly. I know that too. She shifted the weight of the empty box under her arm and looked past him at the Cornerstone Hotel at the end of the street, its windows blank in the failing light. The question is what he can do in 14 days that he hasn't already done. The papers are filed. The letter is sent. The street heard everything that was said this afternoon. She paused. He can make noise. He can apply pressure. He can make certain people in this town very uncomfortable about having shown me any kindness. Her jaw set. What he cannot do is unbuy 25 years' worth of decisions from a ledger that is now in the custody of the territorial mail system. Ben Calloway looked at her for a moment, a considering look, the look of someone taking the full measure of a thing before deciding how to respond to it. There's a scenario he can work, he said carefully. If he can get the boxes back, the documents, everything before that letter reaches the territorial seat, then there's nothing for the register page to be compared against. A certified copy of an entry proves nothing if the receipt it should match has disappeared. Nora's hands went still on the box. He watched her work through it. He did not rush her. A theft charge. It would be simple. She had taken property from land claimed by his company. The papers were evidence of that taking. A territorial warrant could require their surrender pending adjudication, and once surrendered they would go into the custody of whoever Hale controlled, and from there they would go wherever the record of the original filing had gone 25 years ago, which was nowhere recoverable. When would he move? Her voice was flat, operational, fast. Maybe 2 or 3 days. He paused. He needs it done before anyone has time to make copies or establish the document's existence too broadly. Right now only Finch, Amos Red, and the people in that street have heard anything specific. That's a manageable number for a man with his resources. She looked at him. He looked at her. The failing light lay even between them. What are you doing here? She said it without accusation, genuine inquiry. The question she had not asked because the answer had not mattered until now, and now it did. Your investigation is in the next county. Garnet Bend isn't your jurisdiction. Ben Calloway took a breath. Let it out. Looked down the street at the Cornerstone, and then back at her. And there was something in his face that was not quite a decision being made, but decision that had already been made being acknowledged. 3 years ago, he said, I served a warrant on a man named Ira Luce. Farming man, eastern part of the territory, accused of interference with a land survey. I served the warrant correctly. Every step by the book. He died in custody from a wound that wasn't treated properly, because someone decided he wasn't worth the trouble. He stopped. Started again. It came out afterward that the survey he'd supposedly interfered with belonged to a man who'd manufactured the charge to get him off adjacent land he wanted. The law was used exactly right, by exactly the wrong person. And I was the instrument of it. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. I do this job well. I have always done this job well. And I am not willing to do it correctly in the service of a man who has spent 25 years using it as a weapon. The space between them had changed. She could feel that it had changed without being able to name the mechanism. I see. I'm not asking you to trust that. He met her eyes. I'm asking you to let me stay involved in an unofficial capacity until the letter comes back. If Hale moves against you the way I think he will, you'll need someone with a badge who is willing to say that the evidence is in dispute and cannot be compelled to move. She considered him, the size of him, the stillness of him, the specific nature of what he had just told her about himself, which was not a credential, exactly, but was something more personal than a credential, and therefore more difficult to fake. A man who tells you about his failures before he tells you about his intentions is a different kind of man than one who reverses that order. All right, she said. He nodded once, the nod of a man who doesn't make a production of getting what he asked for. She was 3 steps away when he spoke behind her. Miss Voss. She turned. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't fully read in the low light, something that was assembling itself in sort of several components, and had not yet settled into a single recognizable thing. What you said out there. About people who come down off that ridge and aren't believed. He paused. Your father was one of them. It was not a question. He had been listening more carefully than she'd realized. Yes, and you came down. Yes. He held her gaze for one more beat. And they're going to believe you. Said it simply, with the directness of a man who says only what he has already decided is true. Not because you have the papers. Because you brought that family down the mountain and set the woman's leg and stood in front of Edmund Hale, in a torn shirt with mud to your elbows, and said the thing that needed saying. A town can talk itself out of a document. It can't talk itself out of watching something happen. She held that for a moment. Then she nodded and turned and went to find somewhere to sleep. That wasn't the livery loft she'd been evicted from 2 weeks ago. Because the night was coming and she had 14 days ahead of her, and she needed to be present for all of them. The morning after the confrontation, a lean man rode into Garnet Bend from the direction of the territorial seat. He arrived before noon on a road-dusty horse and with a folded paper in his saddlebag and a deputy's star on his coat that was not Ben Calloway's star and did not carry Ben Calloway's history with it. He asked for Nora Voss at the livery, where the liveryman directed him with the careful neutrality of a man who has already done the calculation of which side of this he wants to be remembered as having stood on and has reached a provisional answer. The paper he carried was a complaint of theft. It alleged that Nora Voss had removed valuable property, historical documents and effects from land belonging to the Garnet Bend Land and Cattle Company, of which Edmund Hale was the principal interest, and it demanded the return of all such property, and her appearance at the territorial court to answer for the taking. She read it in the livery yard with the deputy waiting on his horse and the morning sun coming flat and cold over the false fronts of the main street, and the intelligence of it turned her cold in a way that the confrontation the day before had not. Because this was not bluster. This was the move she had anticipated. Hale couldn't attack the documents themselves, he didn't have access to them, and their content was already partially public knowledge. So he had moved to take them back before the register page arrived to confirm them. Dressed it in the language of property rights, made her the thief, made himself the aggrieved party, and sent someone with a badge and a paper to make it look exactly like the law working exactly as it should. Her father had been turned away by this same maneuver 25 years ago. Not turned away at gunpoint, or by threat, turned away by the machinery of official process, wielded by someone who understood that the machinery itself was the weapon. She was not 22. She had not ridden a foundered horse for 2 days to get here, and she had had the night to think. If the land belongs to the Garnet Bend Land and Cattle Company, she said, and kept her voice level. That's what the paper claims. That's what it claims. She looked at the deputy steadily. His face was professionally neutral in the way that faces are neutral when they are doing their job, and have not yet decided whether their job is being used against them. And if the company doesn't own the meadow, if the company has been attempting to acquire ownership of ground to which another party has had a filed and legally valid claim since 1861, then what you've been sent to collect is the proof of that claim, and you would be carrying it back to the man who wants it removed from evidence. She held the paper back out to him. I don't think you rode from the territorial seat to do that, deputy. I think you rode from the territorial seat to serve a theft complaint. Those are different jobs. The deputy looked at the paper. He looked at her. He was the kind of man who took longer than comfortable to answer, not because he was slow, but because he was thorough, and the pause was him being thorough in real time. Ben Calloway arrived from the direction of the land office. He came up beside her and stood, and the geometry of the scene reorganized itself around his presence, the way it always did in enclosed spaces. The deputy's horse shifted its weight. The air in the yard acquired a different quality. Ben said nothing. He simply arrived and stood, and his arrival was its own kind of statement. The deputy looked at him. Ben looked at the paper in the deputy's hand. A conversation happened in the pause that contained no words. There's a clean way to handle this, Ben said, and his voice had the measured quality of a man who has thought through exactly how many words this particular moment requires, and has used exactly that many. The documents are in dispute. There is a pending inquiry with the Territorial Recorder's Office that will resolve the question of ownership. Until that inquiry is complete, the documents can be held under seal at the land office here, locked, witnessed, inaccessible to either party, with the seal broken only when the territorial record comes back. He held the deputy's gaze. That's not resisting the warrant. That's executing it in a manner consistent with an active legal process. Everything by the book. The deputy sat his horse in the livery yard for a long time. Long enough that a jay in the cottonwood beside the fence completed an entire argument with itself and resolved it. Long enough that the cold in the air became tangible rather than ambient. Then he folded the warrant and put it away unserved. The documents go under seal, he has said. 2 locks. Land office custody. Nothing moves until the territorial record comes back. He looked at Nora. If your papers are what you say, the man who swore this warrant has considerably more to answer for than you do. If they're not, I'll be back for you personally, and the second conversation will be harder than this one. Understood, Nora said. They sealed the boxes that afternoon. Both of them, the dovetailed box and the tin document box, in Thomas Finch's office with the deputy and Amos Red and Wallace Pruitt as witnesses. Oilcloth wrapping, linen cord, a wax seal pressed with Finch's ring. 2 locks on the strong box. Finch held one key. The county recorder held the other, and neither could open it alone. Nora watched her father's 25-year-old proof go behind 2 keys, where Hale's smooth voice could not reach it. She felt, for the first time since she'd read the letter on the wagon's tailgate, that she was not carrying the weight of it alone. The next 14 days would be the longest of her life. She knew that before she walked out of Finch's office into the early evening, where the first stars were coming out above Sunder Ridge, and the mountain stood against the sky in its permanent, patient way, keeping what it kept, waiting for whoever was going to come and claim it. She had 14 days, and she intended to be present for every one of them. The pressure began quietly, as Hale's pressures always did. 3 days after the sealing, the liveryman Halsey told Nora he needed the space above his stable back. Not rudely, not with any particular explanation. Just the flat statement of a man who has been told something costs more than he thought, and has decided the accounting isn't worth it. His eyes didn't quite reach hers when he said it. She recognized that particular angle of avoidance. She'd seen it in the faces of neighbors who'd looked through her the morning she led Juniper out through the gate for the last time. The studied non-seeing of people who have decided that what is happening to someone else is not happening close enough to them to require witness. She found a room at the dry goods store. The owner, a wiry woman named Carver, who kept her own counsel and charged fair rates for the cot in her back storeroom, asked no questions and offered no commentary. 2 days after that, the merchant who had extended Nora a small line of credit the week before she went up the mountain sent his son around to say the debt was called due immediately. The amount was not large, but the calling of it, in this particular week, was its own kind of message, the message that said someone with enough reach had been talking to enough people to make the ordinary courtesies of a small town suddenly expensive to offer. Nora paid the debt with the last of what she had. She did it without ceremony. She filed away the fact of the payment and what it implied about the next 10 days, and she went back to Carver's storeroom, and she sat on the cot, and she took stock of what she had and what she did not have, and what she needed to acquire before the territorial letter arrived. What she had: the sealed boxes, legally untouchable until the inquiry resolved. Thomas Finch, who was precise and frightened and holding anyway. Amos Red, who was neither frightened nor easily moved. Ben Calloway, whose continued presence in Garnet Bend had no official explanation and required none. The Marsh family, who were still in the room above the dry goods store while Elsa's leg knit, and who had become in 9 days a fact in the town's daily life, the way that families become facts present at mealtimes, nodding acquaintances at the water trough, the particular texture of people who are surviving something in public and doing it with sufficient dignity that the town has decided to find them admirable rather than inconvenient. What she did not have: money, standing, a roof she could count on, or any guarantee that the territorial letter would say what it needed to say. What she needed for the town to hold. For the faces that had turned toward her on the street after the confrontation to keep turned toward her, rather than swiveling back toward the man who had been feeding them for 25 years, and knew every pressure point that a small economy provided. Elsa Marsh was the thing that held it. She could not have predicted this and would not have asked for it, because it was not a thing you could ask for. It was the kind of thing that happens when a person who has been through something true tells the truth about it, plainly, to the next person who comes in the door, and then the next, and then the next, until the truth has moved through a town the way weather moves, not because anyone organized it, but because it was in the air and people breathe. Elsa sat by the window of the room above the dry goods store, with her splinted leg propped on a wooden footstool, her wool skirt smoothed over it, her hands occupied with the mending she'd asked Carver for, because she could not sit still and do nothing, and her hands needed something the way Nora's hands needed something. She had the invalid chair, a wooden cane contraption with small iron wheels that Pruitt had produced from somewhere in the back of his office, the kind that had been doing service for people who couldn't walk since before the war, and was doing service now pushed to one side. She used it for crossing the room. She sat in the regular chair by the window for company, because the window gave her the street, and the street was where the information was. She told her story the same way every time. Clean, no embroidery, no adjustment to the audience. A man in the low country had told her husband the ridge road was sound. A stranger had come down to them in the dark and the rain, set a broken bone and brought them all off the mountain with nothing asked in return. She named the stranger. When pressed, she described the man who had sent them up his build, his clothes, the hotel behind him, the coffee cup arrested in his hand. She did not name Edmund Hale. She did not need to. In a town of 300 people, a broad, well-dressed man who kept a hotel on the main street and drank coffee on its porch was not a description that admitted of multiple interpretations. I don't say who it was, Elsa would finish, looking mildly through the window at whatever was moving in the street. I only say what he said and what it nearly cost us. A person can work out the rest themselves. Most folks can, once they've a mind to look. And people listen, because people always listen to the account of a near thing, a thing that nearly killed someone, a thing that nearly went differently with a specific quality of attention that they do not give to other stories. The near thing makes the abstract concrete. It makes the what-if personal. A woman with a leg splinted by a stranger is a fact. A well-dressed man who told her husband the road was safe is a fact. The fact of the one standing next to the fact of the other is not a conclusion Elsa Marsh needed to draw for anyone. Wade carried the story too. But the way young men carry stories outward, with motion, into every corner of the town he moved through in the course of the days. He was 19 and recovered and curious, and he had nothing to do while his mother healed except be present in Garnet Bend, and he was very present. He talked to the drover at the livery. He talked to the boy who swept the Cornerstone's front steps. He told the story of the shale crossing in the dark to 3 different people in the span of 2 days, and the story got larger each time. The way stories carried by young people get larger without losing their truth, the dragon's back growing scales and temperament, while the essential fact of the crossing remained exactly what it had been. What the essential fact was, a girl they had been told all week to distrust had carried a family off a mountain in a storm and asked for nothing. It is very difficult to hate someone a town has watched do something unreservedly good. Hale's money could apply pressure to the margins, to the liveryman, to the creditor, to the people at the edges of the social fabric where the threads were thin and the pulling cost something. But it could not reach the center, which was Elsa Marsh by the window, and the mended leg as evidence, and the plain account told the same way to the 30th person as it had been told to the first. Nora noticed the 7th day that fewer people were looking through her on the street, not all of them. The realignment was not complete and would not be complete until the letter came, and perhaps not entirely even then, because some portion of any town will always cleave to the established order out of habit, if not out of conviction. But the careful not seeing was becoming more selective, and in its place, in some faces, was something more complicated, the expression of people who are revising an assessment they'd made too quickly, and are not certain yet how to show that they've revised it. The woman with the flower on her sleeve nodded to her outside the baker's. The drover moved to make room at the counter of the dry goods store. Small things. The kind of things that don't mean much individually and mean everything in aggregate. Hale did not appear on his porch during this time. He was in the hotel, but he was quiet, and the quality of his quiet had changed. It was no longer the quiet of a man above the fray, but the quiet of a man making calculations behind a closed door. She could feel the calculations the way you feel weather changing in the pressure of the air, the way you feel a river running high beneath its surface calm. She was thinking about this on the evening of the 13th day, when she found Ben Calloway sitting on the steps of the land office, not waiting for her specifically, or not only for her. He was sitting in the way that large men sit on small steps somewhat folded, making accommodations for a frame that the architecture had not anticipated, his hat on his knee and his forearms resting on his thighs. The last light of the day was coming low and gold from the west, laying itself flat across the main street, and it caught the side of his face at the angle that showed what the years of working in open country do to a face, not damage exactly, but inscription, the record of weather and attention and the specific kind of sustained effort that leaves marks. She sat down beside him, not because she'd decided to, exactly because the step was there, and he was on it, and her feet were tired from a day of being watchfully present. Neither of them said anything for a while. The street went about its evening business. The light changed by slow degrees from gold to amber to the particular gray-blue of dusk that precedes dark without quite being dark yet, in which everything is still visible but beginning to belong to the night rather than the day. "Sarah," he said and paused. Started again. Her name was Sarah Calloway. She was from the eastern part of the territory, a doctor's daughter, which meant she'd grown up around sick people and knew how not to be frightened of them. He stopped. She had the habit of laughing before she'd finished thinking of the funny thing, so you'd hear the laugh and then wait for the reason, and the reason was always worth waiting for. A breath. She died in April. 3 years ago. I was serving a warrant 2 counties east. By the time I got back, she'd been gone 4 days. The town made its quiet noises. A horse at the livery. The baker closing his shutters. "I could have been there," he said. "That's the part I have never been able to resolve. The warrant could have waited 1 more week. I made a professional judgment that it couldn't, and I was wrong, and by the time I understood I was wrong, there was nothing left to be right about." Nora listened. She'd not try to correct the weight of it, did not try to reframe it toward mercy or away from responsibility, because she had learned from her father's history that false comfort is its own kind of injury. It tells a person their actual feeling is wrong, which is the thing they least need to hear, when they are already carrying the consequences of being wrong about something else. "My father," she said, when the pause had room for it, "used to sit on the porch after supper and look up at the ridge. I thought for years it was just a way he had a man who liked to sit and look at the country in the evening. I didn't understand until 9 days ago that what he was looking at was the place where he had left something unfinished and could not make himself go back to finish it." She turned a dried grass stem between her fingers. "He died not knowing whether the people on that mountain ever came down. He carried that as a failure for 30 years, and it was not his failure." Ben turned his head to look at her. She felt the looking without returning it yet. "The not knowing," he said. "The not knowing is the worst of it. A wrong thing you did. You can at least be specific about what you did. But not knowing whether the people you tried to help survived, that's a wound that can't close because there's nothing to close it with." She set the grass stem down. "I found letters in a hiding place in his wagon. He wrote them to himself, because he had no one else to tell." A long pause. "He left me the box," she said. "He made it by hand the winter after I was born and carried it up the mountain and put the documents inside and hid it where someone might find it. He couldn't go back himself. But he built a door for whoever might come." Ben Calloway looked at the ridge in the last light, its outline going dark against a sky that still held color. He looked at it for a long time. "That's not the act of a man who had given up," he said. "A man who has given up doesn't build anything." She had not thought of it in exactly those terms. She let it in. "No," she said. "It isn't." Another silence, the kind that is not empty but full. The kind that 2 people sit in together when they have said the difficult things, and the space after the saying is not nothing but something. "I think I've been checking exits," he said quietly. "For 3 years. Every room I walk into. Every town I ride into." He looked at his hat on his knee. "It's become a habit I don't particularly want anymore." She turned to look at him then, because the sentence had a weight she wanted to receive properly. "What would you do instead?" Not a leading question, a real one. He met her eyes. "Stay somewhere long enough to find out what I would do instead." She held that. Then she said, "The letter comes tomorrow." "Yes, and then we'll know." Yes. They sat on the land office steps until the last color went out of the sky, and the street lamp at the corner was the only light left, and neither of them moved to end the evening, and neither of them needed to say why. She went to Cora Wynn's house the next morning, before the mail stage could arrive, because she had been putting off this visit for days in the way you put off a thing you are not certain you are ready for. Cora opened the door before Nora's hand finished rising toward it. The inside of the house was small and clean dried herbs hung from the low rafters, a fire in the iron stove, a smell of wood smoke, and something botanical she couldn't name. Cora lowered herself into the chair by the hearth with the careful movement of someone who has learned to be patient with their own body. She looked at Nora sitting across from her for a long moment, reading something in her face. "You have his brow," she said at last, and the way he had of going quiet before he spoke, as though he wanted to be sure the words were ready before he committed them to the air. She paused. "I knew whose you were the night I stopped you in the alley. I have known your father's face for 25 years, though he never knew mine, because I was 22 the last time he saw me, and people change beyond recognition in 25 years except to those who are looking for them." Nora went very still. "I was on that train." Cora said it simply, the way she said everything as though the truth of it was large, but the words for it were ordinary, and the gap between the two was just something you lived with. "My mother kept the ledger. That was her hand you read, all the way to the last entry. The open arc that was her decision. She was the one who understood what the shape of it needed to say. The children Nora managed. The ledger said they were mending. They were. And here something eased in Cora Wynn's face, some long-held tension, releasing the way water releases when a dam finally cracks, not in flood but in the quiet giving way of something that had been under pressure too long. "Every person on that train came down off the mountain, Nora. Every one of them. We walked down the deer trail in the one clear weather window the mountain gave us, 4 days through the high country, carrying the ones who couldn't walk the distance on their own. And we came out into a settlement 2 days south of here that had never heard of Garnet Bend." The room was absolutely quiet. "Your father did not fail us." Cora leaned forward and the firelight caught the wet brightness in her pale eyes. "He rode down to get help and he was turned away by a wicked man, and we did not know that. We only knew the snow was coming and the little ones were on the mend, and we dared not wait. So we carried them out ourselves, and we made it. And by the time we were strong enough to think of going back, we had learned through a freighter what had been done, that a young outrider had come down, swearing we were lost and been called a liar, and that the ground we had filed on had been declared abandoned and taken up by the clerk who had buried our claim." Nora pressed both palms flat on her knees. "We understood what had been done," Cora continued, "and we were poor and frightened and scattered, and the man who had taken our meadow was already building what he has spent 30 years building. We chose our families over the fight. I will not pretend that was courage. It was fear dressed in practical clothes, and I have carried the knowledge of what it cost your father every day since." Her voice did not waver. It was the voice of someone who has said a thing so many times inside herself that saying it out loud has become simply the external form of an internal truth. "He rode down in good faith and was stopped by fraud, and then rode back up to find us gone, and had no way to know whether we had come out safe or were still somewhere above him in the snow. That uncertainty, not knowing, was the wound, and we let him carry it." The fire ticked in the stove. Outside, somewhere down the street, a horse went by at a walk. "Why did you come back here?" Nora's voice was not steady. She let it be not steady, because there was no one to be steady for in this room, because someone had to keep the door open from this side. Cora folded her hands in her lap. The others scattered. "I came back old enough that Hale would not look at me twice. Strange enough that the town would leave me to my churchyard and my herbs. I came back to watch the ridge road, to be present if anyone ever came down with the right question. To be the thing on the near end of the door your father left open on the far end." She paused. "And because I have never stopped feeling responsible for a 22-year-old boy who rode down a mountain to save our lives and came back to silence and has been in silence ever since." Nora pressed the back of her hand to her mouth. "I wrote letters," Cora said. She rose carefully and went to a small chest against the wall, the movement of a woman who has crossed this particular floor so many times that it requires no attention, who could make this crossing in the dark. She lifted from the chest a bundle of envelopes, cream-colored, tied with a length of ribbon the color of dried sage. "Every person from that train who lived, and their children, and some of their children's children. I know where every one of them settled, what names they took. She brought the bundle to Nora and held it out. I never sent them. I was afraid of drawing Hale's attention to people who had spent 25 years beyond his reach. But Hale is going to answer to a court now, and there is no longer any reason on this earth for those families to remain strangers to what is theirs. Nora looked at the bundle in her hands. Letters for people she didn't know yet, in addresses across the territory she had never visited, describing a meadow they had left in a hurry 25 years ago, with the intention of returning, and had never been allowed to return to. You will bring them home to the meadow that was always theirs, Cora said. That is the rest of the work. Not the legal work that is nearly done. The other work. The returning of people to the place they were always supposed to be. She sat back down in her chair and looked at Nora across the fire, with the eyes that had been watching the Ridge Road for a quarter century. That is how you finish what your father started. Not by winning in a land office, though you must win there too. By filling the meadow with the sound of the people it was always meant for, until the silence that Hale made is so thoroughly undone that it cannot be remembered as the natural state of things. Nora sat with the letters in her lap for a long time. Then the sound of the mail stage reached her through the window, the particular rhythm of 4 horses on the main street's packed dirt, the jingle of the traces, the driver's call to the horses as he brought them down. She was on her feet before she'd decided to stand. The news traveled through Garnet Bend faster than she could walk to the land office. By the time she arrived, the street outside was filling not a crowd in the dramatic sense. No shouting, no assembly. Just the natural aggregation of people who have been waiting for something, and have suddenly understood that the waiting is over. Thomas Finch had not opened the envelope alone. He had sent the livery boy running for Ben Calloway, for Amos Red, for Wallace Pruitt, for the county recorder, for Nora, and the running of the boy through the streets had done what the boy had not needed to announce, which was to communicate that the moment had arrived. Edmund Hale came down from the cornerstone. She saw him from the corner of the dry goods store moving along the boardwalk with his hat pulled and his jaw set and 2 men from his company behind him. He did not look at her. He was looking at the land office door. He was a man who had staked everything on a page and could not stay away when the page was opening. She went in ahead of him. The land office was not large. The front counter, 3 chairs, the strong box against the back wall, the window that Finch had used to examine the survey lines. It was full now with the people Finch had called Amos with his darkened hands loose at his sides, Pruitt with his arms folded, Ben standing at the left wall where his height required no further presence to register. The county recorder, a stout man named Beaumont, who had done this job for 15 years, and had the expression of someone who had opened a great many territorial communications and had never opened one that felt like this. Finch broke the seal. The room did not breathe. He unfolded the certified copy of the register page from the territorial recorder's office, heavy paper, official stamp at the top, the recorder's signature running along the lower margin in the precise hand of a man who understood the weight of the document he was certifying. He laid it flat on the counter. He smoothed it with both hands. He found the line. His finger stopped, his face told it before his voice could find it. The filing number on Garrett Voss's receipt, the number she had carried down the mountain in the oilcloth wrapping, matched a line in the master register. But the line in the register did not carry the names of the 2 families of the wagon train. It had been altered. Beneath the alteration, still visible in the original ink, faint, subordinate, but present, the way things written in earnest do not entirely disappear even when written over the original entry, showed the meadow filed to 2 family names in the spring of 1861. Above it, in different ink and a different, more casual hand, a note of abandonment and reversion dated 3 years later, and beneath that, the assignment of the ground to a new filler whose name occupied the space where the original claimants' names had stood. That name was known to everyone in the room. Finch's voice when it came was not quite steady, but it was precise, because precision was the only thing he had to offer, and he gave it completely. He didn't tear it out. A torn page shows. He wrote over it. He let the original filing number stand and changed what the number referred to. He looked up from the page, and his young face had gone hard in a way that did not suit his usual expression, and had clearly never been called for before, and was equal to the occasion anyway. 25 years. The entry has been here for 25 years. All it required was a receipt to match it against. The street had heard enough through the open door. Nora became aware of Hale behind her. He had come in, she didn't know when exactly, somewhere in the silence of Finch's reading, and stood at the back of the room, where the crowd had made space for him, not out of deference but out of the human instinct to give a man room when he is about to be undone. She turned. He was looking at the certified page across the heads of the people between them, with the expression of a man watching something he had believed impossible arrive anyway. The expression of someone who had organized his entire understanding of how the world worked around the certainty that no one would ever come down off that ridge to make this moment happen. That ground was doing nothing. His voice had lost the butter and the warmth, and what remained was thinner and more honest, and therefore somehow more offensive than the smooth version had ever been. It was sitting empty, rotting, no one going near it for a generation. I built something here. I put money into this town and raised its buildings and fed its economy, and you will not throw 25 years of that over a box of dead men's papers. The room was very quiet. She moved through it. People shifted to let her through, not because they had been asked to, but because the moment had a direction and she was it. She came to stand where he could not avoid looking at her. It was not doing nothing, she said. Not loudly. Loudly was not what this required. It was keeping. That is the difference. You never understood the difference between a thing you cannot see use in and a thing that has no use. Those families did not file on empty ground. They filed on a home. They went back for their families and their goods, and they were bringing everything they had up to a place that was already, by law, theirs. And one man in a land office decided their being far away was the same as their being gone, and their being gone was the same as their being nothing. She stepped toward him, and the crowd completed the parting. You spent 25 years making certain that no one came down off that ridge to trouble you, and in the end, the one who came down was not a stranger at all. She held his gaze without accommodation. She was the daughter of the man you turned away in the snow. My father rode down that trail to you for help when he was younger than I am now, and you sent him back believing he had failed everyone who trusted him. He carried that lie for the rest of his life. She did not raise her voice. She let the silence of the room do the work that volume would have spoiled. I am giving it back. Ben served the warrant. The real one, the territorial warrant sworn on the strength of the certified register page, for the fraudulent alteration of an official land record, for the misrepresentation of abandonment on ground that had never been abandoned, for the 25 years of sustained fraud that had followed the initial act. He served it in front of the entire assembled room and the street beyond the open door, and he did it with the specific economy of a man who understands that this moment does not require theater, only completion. Hale's 2 men from the company had drifted, by the time the warrant was out, to a position slightly removed from the subtle repositioning of people who have just discovered that the ground they were standing on has a different owner than they'd been told. He went with Ben without resistance, because resistance was beneath the last version of dignity he could find, and because there was, in the end, nothing left to resist with. The smoothness was gone. The certainty was gone. What walked out of the land office between Ben Calloway and the room's collective gaze was simply a man of late middle age who had made a particular set of choices over the course of a long career and was now in the process of discovering what those choices had built. The town watched him go, and no one cheered and no one jeered because it was not that kind of moment. It was a quiet crime's quiet undoing, and the town had been complicit in it for 25 years through the mechanism of believing the easy story. And some part of every person in that street carried the small specific discomfort of that complicity. The silence was not emptiness. It was the town deciding what kind of place it wanted to be in the next part of the story. Nora turned to Thomas Finch. "The claim stands," she said. "It was lawful. It was never abandoned." Finch looked down at the certified page, at the faint true entry beneath the false one. The reversion was fraudulent, which makes it void, which means the claim never lapsed. He lifted his eyes to her, and there was a question in them he was too careful to ask directly. "In law, the meadow has belonged without interruption to the families of that wagon train and their heirs, since the spring of 1861. She set her hand on the counter beside his. "Then you'll need the name of the heir," she said, to enter against it. She said her father's name. His full name, the name he had carried out of the low country 30 years ago, and buried so thoroughly under silence that she had not known it was different from the name he'd used until she found it in the ledger, in the careful hand of a woman who had written it down because he had been worth writing down. She said it aloud in the Garnet Bend land office with the whole town at the door, and she watched Thomas Finch write it into the register with his careful upright hand, and the writing of it restored to the record the man a land clerk had written out of it 30 years ago. Then she gave Finch her own name to enter beneath it. Daughter and heir. The pen moved, the ink dried, and the sound of that small transaction was the quietest thing in the world and the largest thing that had happened to her in her life. And she stood at the counter with both hands flat on its surface and let it settle into her without trying to speak around it or past it, because some things need to be inhabited rather than described, and this was one of them. She walked out into a street that had not finished deciding how to look at her. The woman with flour on her sleeve came out of the bakery with a wrapped loaf and pressed it into Nora's hands without a word, and stepped back before any response was possible. Not much, not enough, if you were counting. But the kind of beginning that begins the way most real things begin, without announcement, without ceremony, in a small and slightly clumsy gesture, by someone who knows they owe more than they can currently pay, and is making the first installment anyway. Nora took it. Because a person who cannot receive the imperfect apologies of imperfect people has not finished learning what a mountain has to teach. The street did not know how to look at her. That was the specific texture of the aftermath, not hostility, not welcome, but the particular uncertainty of a town that has spent a week being carefully instructed to regard someone as a problem, and a single afternoon watching that instruction collapse. Faces she passed on the way from the land office recalibrated in small ways, a fractional opening around the eyes, a jaw adjusting, the involuntary tell of people discovering that the category they had assigned someone no longer holds the person standing in front of them. She let them look. She performed nothing in either direction. Amos Red caught her at the corner. He took her hand between both of his, the iron-dark hands that had held the map for 40 years, that had pressed it into hers outside the wheelwright's shop and closed her fingers over it with the deliberateness of a man passing something he had been holding in trust. He did not speak. The pressure of his grip said what it needed to say, and she received it without words because some transactions do not improve with them. Elsa Marsh had heard from her window before Nora reached the dry goods store. The street's murmur moved the way news moves in small places, not in organized announcement, but in the frequency of many people adjusting their voices at once, a shift in the ambient sound of a town that is processing something. By the time Nora came through the door, Elsa was already turned in her chair with her hands folded and her eyes clear. The look between them required nothing further because they had already said the difficult things to each other on a rain-soaked slope in the dark, and everything since had been consequence working itself out. Owen shook her hand. Wade, standing taller than he had seemed in the meadow, or perhaps simply more present now that solid ground was beneath him, held out the smoke-gray felt hat. She stopped. He was holding it in both hands, the brim between his fingers, the horsehair band still intact. The crown faded from its original black to the color of wood smoke after decades of hanging from a hook in a wagon no one had entered. He had kept it. Through the descent and the town and the days of recovery, he had held on to it as though he understood it was not his to discard. I figured it belonged up there, he said. His voice had the careful quality of a young man saying something he has thought about, and is saying now because the moment is right and will not be right again in the same way. Or to whoever goes back up. Nora took the hat from him, held it. The felt was softer than she expected, decades of mountain air working at the fibers. The structure still holding, but the surface worn to a gentleness that new cloth doesn't have. Her father had touched this, had hung it on that hook with his own hands in 1861, and it had waited there through 25 winters while he came down to the valley and built a life in the shadow of a decision he believed had broken him. She turned it once in her hands. It goes back up, she said. Not to Wade specifically. To the room, to the hat, to whatever part of the arrangement still needed to hear it. Wade nodded with the gravity of someone who has just confirmed a thing he already knew but needed to say aloud to make real. She went to find Ben Calloway. He was at the far end of the street where the buildings gave out, and the wagon track ran south into open country, sitting on the top rail of the fence that edged the last property before the land opened, his hat off and his face turned to the late afternoon sky. His horse Vander was tied at the bottom rail, working through the sparse grass along the fence line with philosophical patience. She climbed up beside him without announcing herself, because he had already heard her coming, and was not the kind of man who needed the warning of a greeting. The light was going long and gold in the way October light goes in this country, laying itself flat across the landscape, finding every variation in the terrain, and making it briefly monumental before the dark came and erased it again. 3 weeks for the territorial court to confirm jurisdiction, she said. Finch is preparing the documents to formally record the claim in my father's name and mine. Beaumont says it's clean, no further challenges possible once the registration is complete. I heard. He held his hat on his knee and looked at the country. What happens to the meadow? She had been thinking about Cora Wynn's letters since the moment they were placed in her hands, that bundle of careful handwriting, addressed to people living under names they had taken for safety, raising children who knew the mountain only as a story their grandmother told in the years when she finally had distance enough to tell it. There are families in this territory who have a right to stand in that meadow that no court proceeding can fully give them. The legal claim is one thing, the returning is another. He was quiet, absorbing the distinction. Some of them won't come, she continued. Some of them have built lives so fully elsewhere that the meadow is already resolved for them. It became story, and they made their peace with story. But some of them will want to see it, and all of them deserve to be asked. That's not short work. No. He looked at the ridge in the fading light, Sunder Ridge's outline going dark against a sky that still held color in its upper register. I've been thinking about something, Finch said, about the territorial office. There are cases in 2 adjacent counties' land arrangements that Hale used the same mechanism for. The railroad expansion created pressure points all through the northern districts, and a patient man with access to official records had years to work. He paused. The territorial marshal's office wants someone to investigate those cases. Someone who understands what to look for in an altered register, how to match a receipt against a buried filing, how to recognize the signature of this particular kind of fraud. She waited, because she had learned that Ben Calloway arrived at his point by his own route and arrived at it correctly, and interrupting the route was not worth the shortcut. The position allows for movement, he said. It's not a fixed office assignment. It follows the work, which means the work goes where the cases are. He turned to look at her, and in his face was the absence of the professional composure he maintained in public spaces, the version of him that existed below the surface version, steadier and more tired and more honest than the one the street saw. I want to ask you something. Ask. He did not look away. I have spent 3 years checking exits, walking into rooms with an eye on the door, riding into towns with a settled understanding that the stay was temporary. I made a habit of it after Sarah died, because staying in one place required believing it would hold, and I was not certain anything would hold. He paused, and it was not the pause of hesitation, but the pause of a man making certain the next words were exactly right. You ride into situations that would turn most people around. You hold a lamp steady while someone sets bone. You say the true hard thing in the open street in front of people who have not earned it. I don't want to go somewhere else and do something else. A breath. I want to do this work, and I want to do it alongside whatever you are building. Formally. The fence rail was cold under her hands. The last light was working on the ridge above the town. August, she said. He blinked a small fracture in his stillness, which was how she knew she had surprised him. The first family visits in June. If the letters come back the way I expect them to. There will be a second visit in July. She looked at the trail that ran north and disappeared into the timber. August. There will be a week between visits, when the meadow is in full summer and the trail is at its best. She turned to look at him directly. I would like Cora Wynn to be there. She has kept that door open from the valley side for 25 years. She should be standing in the meadow when the first family walks through. He understood. She could see the understanding arrive, not gradually but whole, the way he understood most things, in a single completed motion. August, he said. Yes, he almost smiled, the almost was sufficient. She went to see Cora Wynn the following morning, with a bundle of unsent letters and a fresh sheet of paper, and she sat at the old woman's table while Cora told her what she knew of each address, which settlements had grown, which had dried up, which family names had changed through marriage or necessity, who Cora believed still living. Nora wrote for 2 hours. When she was done, she had mapped not geography but dispersal, 25 years of people settling into the distances they had put between themselves and the thing that frightened them. The youngest family, Cora said near the end. The ones who were very small when we came down. They are adults now, some with grandchildren of their own. They were told stories. Their parents described the mountain, the meadow, the wagons. Some of them will have made it mythological in the way people make into myth the things they cannot verify. She looked at her folded hands. You will have to show them the ledger. Let them see their families' names in it. Let them understand that the record existed while they were living at a distance from it, that the record was waiting for them the whole time. And my father's letters? Cora was quiet for a moment. Let them read those too, if they're willing. Let them understand that the man who rode down the mountain for them did it knowing the risk, and went back up when the pass cleared, and found the meadow empty, and did not know whether they had lived or died. She paused. People can do more with the human version of a story than with the heroic one. The human version is the one where he was 22 years old and frightened and went anyway. That is the version worth telling. The letters went out in batches over the following weeks, written by hand at Carver's table late at night, by lamplight, with the care she gave to things that mattered. She included a copy of the certified register entry, a summary of the legal proceeding, and in each letter a paragraph about Garrett Voss. Not a eulogy, a factual account, what he had done, what had been done to him, what he had not known, and what he had built from not knowing. She wrote it the same way each time. She let the facts carry the weight because the facts were sufficient. The first response came back in 18 days from a woman named May, who wrote from a settlement 2 days south by stage. She was 38 years old. Her mother had talked about the mountain in her last years, the way people talk about a thing they have needed to say for a long time, and are finally running low on time in which to say it. She said there was a meadow. May's letter read. She said in the morning the dew made it look like the grass was on fire. I thought she was making it beautiful because she missed it. I understand now, she was telling me exactly what it looked like. Ben read the letters when Nora brought them to the table in the back room above the dry goods store. He read each one in full, set it down carefully, and did not offer his response immediately. He was, she had discovered across the weeks of shared work, slightly better company than he appeared to be in public, not different, but more fully himself. At the table with the Marsh family and the maps and the copies of Finch's documents, he was a man who took his hat off and put his elbows on the table and was present without performing anything. She noticed. She let herself notice without cataloging it, which was its own kind of progress. The weeks had their own texture, slower than the 14-day wait, different from the urgency of the confrontation. More administrative. 3 more certified letters between Finch and the territorial office. The 2 company men who had quietly repositioned themselves away from Hale in the land office proved forthcoming with the court investigator, and cases opened in 2 adjacent counties. Ben's involvement expanded accordingly, and the expansion suited him. She could see it in the quality of his attention when he was working, the way he moved through the paperwork with the same care he moved through physical terrain. The Marsh family left for the Kettle Valley crossing in late November, a month after Elsa's leg was cleared for travel. Owen shook Nora's hand at the livery, then held it a moment longer than a handshake required. Elsa embraced her without preamble, the embrace of a woman who does not perform affection, and therefore means it completely when she gives it. Wade was last. He had his own horse now, a young dun from the livery that he'd paid for from the wages he'd earned helping Amos Red through the autumn months. He was taller than he had been in October. Not in height, in the bearing of him, the way he occupied space. He had come up the mountain a boy carried by his father, and was leaving a young man who had carried his share of what the weeks had required. He stopped in front of Nora and held out his hand, and when she took it, he covered it briefly with his other one, the same gesture Amos used. She noticed, and wondered whether he had picked it up consciously, or whether the gesture had simply found him through proximity to the older man. "The hat," he said. "You'll take it back up." "I'll take it back up." He nodded, released her hand, mounted the dun and rode out with his parents into the November morning, and she watched them until the wagon track bent and they were gone. They left on the last day of July, a party of 6. Nora and Ben. Cora Wynn on the gentle mare that Pruitt had lent without being asked. Amos Red, who had declined to be excluded on the grounds that he had kept the map for 40 years and intended to see what it led to, and the 4 alderman siblings, whose grandmother had been one of the wagon train's 2 wives. They had come from the western part of the territory 2 days by stage, then hired horses at Garnet Ben's livery, and they had the look of people who have traveled a long way towards something they were not certain they believed in, and are not yet sure whether what they find will be what they came for. The trail in late July was different from the trail in October, in the way that the same river in summer is different from the same river in winter, recognizably the same thing but carrying a completely different weight. The high country was hospitable now, the granite warming by midday, the creeks lower and clear as glass, the aspen on the lower slopes already edging toward gold at the tips where the nights had been cool. The air held warmth until evening and released it without complaint. Nora led them up without commentary on what they would find, because she had learned from May's visit in June that the meadow required encounter on its own terms. A description prepared a person for a specific version of the thing. The actual thing was better without that preparation, more complete, more itself, more able to do what it needed to do to whoever stood in it. The meadow opened without announcement. Timber stepping back, ground leveling. The long bowl of grass under a July sky so saturated with blue it seemed to have weight, and in the center of that bowl 6 wagons in their arc canvas tops gray as driftwood but whole, tongues blocked and solid, the open eastern gap exactly where it had always been. The alderman siblings stopped their horses at the edge. She had sent them the photograph in advance, a card-sized image. Finch had arranged with a photographer from 3 towns over, taken in June when the light was right. She had learned from May that the first sight needed to not be simultaneously the site of the most difficult processing. But a photograph in a parlor is not the meadow in July, and the gap between those 2 things was apparent in the faces of the 4 people who had just ridden out of the timber and found themselves standing in the real version of a story their grandmother had told for 40 years. Ruth Aldrin, 45. Her grandmother's name given to her deliberately, the same deliberateness evident in everything about her, sat her horse at the meadow's edge and did not speak. Her brother James, beside her, was crying without appearing to notice that he was doing it. Her 2 sisters had gotten down from their horses and were standing in the grass with their hands at their sides. Cora Wynn on Pruitt's gentle mare had gone very still. Nora watched them all and did not move to organize what was happening, because what was happening was already organized in the only way that mattered, by the meadow itself, by the specific quality of its stillness, by the 25 years of keeping that the place had done without being asked to. She had been here since dawn. She had done it alone, in the early morning before anyone else was awake, in the camp they'd made at the base of the trail, riding up on Juniper to do the one thing she had planned since October and had been waiting for this moment to complete. The wooden horse was on the driver's seat of the first wagon. She had taken it from her coat pocket where it had been riding since she came down the mountain in October, small and solid against her ribs through all the weeks of confrontation and waiting and legal procedure and letter writing, and she had set it on the driver's bench in the morning light, its one repaired leg, the iron pin driven crosswise through the brake by her father's hands in lantern light in 1861, caught the early sun. The painted eye was long gone, worn away by decades, but the groove of it was still there in the wood, the suggestion of seeing, the record of a face that had once looked out at the world and had been looked at in return. She had set it where the first person up the trail would see it before they saw anything else. Ruth found it. She had dismounted and was walking the arc slowly, the way Nora had walked it in October, reading the stillness, taking the inventory of what 25 years of keeping had preserved. She came around the front of the first wagon and stopped. She looked at the wooden horse for a long time without touching it. Then she lifted her eyes to Nora across the meadow, and the expression in them was not grief exactly, and not relief exactly, but the thing that exists between those 2 states when a person has been holding them separately for a long time, and they suddenly resolve into a single feeling that does not have a ready name. My grandmother described this, Ruth said. Her voice carried clearly in the meadow's still air. She said there was a child's toy. She said it had been broken and someone had mended it. She could see the repair when she packed it the morning they left. She said the care taken with such a small thing told her something about the kind of people they were traveling with. A pause. I didn't know it would still be here. Nora crossed the grass and stood with her. I brought it back up this morning. It came down with me in October. She looked at the small carved figure on the bench. My father mended it. In 1861. Before the families went down, someone had broken it and he repaired it by lamplight, so whoever found it in the morning would find it whole. Ruth absorbed this. He was 22. Yes, that's younger than my youngest. Ruth's jaw worked briefly. A 22-year-old man fixed a child's toy by lantern light on a mountain because a child was going to need to find it whole in the morning. She looked at the wooden horse. That is who he was. Yes. Nora let the word stand without adding to it. Ruth reached out and set her fingers on the mended leg, the iron pin, the smooth filing, the evidence of work done with care for someone who would never know it had been done. She held her fingers there for a long moment. Then she looked at Nora with the directness of someone who has been carrying a question for a long time and has decided that the moment will not be more appropriate in the future than it is right now. Tell me his name. Garrett Voss. Ruth said it back, quietly, with the weight of someone recording a thing for permanent keeping. Garrett Voss. She looked at the wooden horse. My grandmother called him only the young outrider. In everything she wrote, everything she said, the young outrider. She never learned his name. She said she had always meant to ask, and the opportunity never came. Her hand dropped from the leg of the wooden horse to her side. I'd like to know it now. I'd like to take it home and write it down next to everything else she left. Nora felt the sentence land in her chest and settle. At the second wagon, Cora Wynn had gotten down from the gentle mare and was standing with one hand on the sideboard. She had been moving toward this wagon since they arrived, with the inevitability of someone returning to a thing they have been circling for a long time. Her mother had written the ledger. Her mother had tied the forward canvas, and looked back once when they walked out through the eastern gap. Cora had told Nora this in the second long conversation. The detail that had not fit into the first, and the looking back was not hesitation, but the act of a woman committing a last sight to memory before entrusting the thing she was leaving to whatever came next. Nora walked to Cora and stood with her. The old woman's hand on the sideboard was thin, the knuckles still holding their shape through 65 years of everything life had asked. She was not crying. She was doing the still inward form of feeling that Nora had come to recognize as hers. The face going quiet around the eyes, the breath slowing. It's the same, Cora said. 30 years and it is the same. She was quiet for a moment. My mother would have come back immediately if she could. She was not a woman who left things unfinished when there was any alternative. The fact that she never returned was the measure of how clearly we understood what we were up against. Her hand moved against the wood, barely perceptibly, the gesture of someone registering grain and texture, and the specific weight of decades. She built a good life after this. She raised two children. She was the first woman in her county to sign a legal document in her own name, and she made a point of signing it slowly. The corner of Cora's mouth moved. She would have found it appropriate that the document which mattered most was eventually signed by her daughter, sitting in the house behind a churchyard, handing a bundle of unsent letters to a girl in a dead man's coat. Nora looked at the eastern gap, the door in the arc, the trail that ran down toward Garnet Bend. She kept the right things. She kept what she could. Cora released the sideboard slowly. That is all any of us do. The fire that evening was in the same sheltered place, under the third wagon's tailgate, overhang the same angle, the same protection from the night wind that came off the higher country, the same smell of dry wood taking a flame and deciding to trust it. The alderman's siblings were quieter around it than they had been on the trail. The specific quiet of people who have arrived somewhere they did not fully believe was real and have found it more real than they prepared for. James Alderman spoke across the fire, when the light had gone low and the stars had come out in the numbers that the high country produces, the structural stars, the load-bearing ones. He spoke with the careful quality of a man who has been turning something over all day and is ready to say it aloud because the saying is the last thing required. My grandmother never blamed him, he said. Looking at Nora across the fire, directly, the way people look at someone when they want the thing they're saying to arrive without deflection. Your father. Wrote about him years later, when she was old enough to write about it, without the fear sitting on top of the words. She said he was the kind of young man who runs toward the hard thing rather than away from it. She said the difference between a person who runs toward and a person who runs away is not usually courage but the failure to fully calculate the cost. Nora held that. She meant it as a compliment, James said. I know. She looked at the fire. He kept running toward things his whole life after. Small things, mostly. A neighbor's fence that needed mending. Tools lent without being asked for. He used to say a person who waits to be useful until something big comes along is usually not useful when it does. She paused. I thought it was just his character. I understand now it was also practice. The only way to keep being the kind of person who goes toward the hard thing is to do it in small ways continuously, so the instinct doesn't atrophy from disuse. Ben, across the fire, was looking at her. She felt it and did not look away from the flames. She let the sentence finish doing what it was doing in the air around the fire, which was telling everyone present something about Garrett Voss, that the ledger and the letters and the legal documents could not tell the texture of who he had been in the ordinary days, the person that the wound had not managed to unmake. The first day of August was a clear morning. She had arranged it deliberately, the alderman's siblings departing that afternoon with certified copies of the relevant documents and a commitment from Finch that the formal recording of their grandmother's share of the claim would be complete within 60 days. The other families were in correspondence. The work was in motion in the way that work gets into motion when it has been set up properly, not urgently but persistently, each step producing the conditions for the next. What remained was the thing between them, which had been in motion since an October night, when she had chosen to walk toward a voice in the dark rather than away from it, or perhaps since an afternoon in a hotel dining room when a man had not laughed. The origin was less important than the trajectory, which had been consistent since the beginning. She found Ben at the eastern gap at dawn. He was standing in the opening in the arc, looking down the trail toward the valley, hat in hand. He heard her coming through the grass and did not turn immediately, in his manner finishing one thing before beginning the next. Then he turned. The morning light was the low sideways light of early August at altitude, finding the things worth finding and leaving the rest in shadow. It found the lines in his face, the ones from years of working in open country, the one at the corner of his mouth that she had decided months ago was from something other than smiling and had been right about, and had then decided was from something other than grief, and had been right about that too. It found the steadiness in his eyes that had been the first thing she trusted and had not given her reason to revise that trust since. He looked at her across the morning. I was thinking about the box, he said. The dovetailed box. Your father made it the winter after you were born and carried it up the mountain and left it where it would last until someone came. He looked at the trail falling away toward the valley below. A man who has given up makes no preparations for the future. He seals things rather than building doors into them. He paused. Your father built a door. He built it before you could walk, for a person he could not yet know, because he believed that person would come. She stood in the gap beside him. The grass was wet with August dew at this hour, and the air was cold with the specific cold of altitude morning that burns off by midday and is forgotten by afternoon and remembered again at dawn. I want to ask you something, he said. Ask, he asked. She took 3 seconds. Not from uncertainty, from the sentence deserving exactly that weight. The weight of 3 seconds in which she felt what it was and found it the right size for her particular kind of carrying. Then she said yes. Clean and whole, without the performance of joy or the performance of composure. Just yes, in the voice she used when she meant something completely. He put his hand over hers where it rested on the wagon tongue at the edge of the gap. The warmth of it was the warmth of a man who has made a decision and has stopped holding margin against revising it. She turned her hand and held back. They stood in the door her father had built, the meadow behind them and the trail before them, and the morning held its light across the grass with the specific generosity of early August at high elevation, which is not the dramatic light of storm or sunset but the steady, sufficient workday light of a world that intends to continue, that winter. The house at the end of Garnet Bend's main street, far enough from the repainted Cornerstone Hotel that the view from the front window was the wagon track, and beyond it, Sunder Ridge rising into the first November dark with snow on its upper reaches. The desk by that window held the ongoing correspondence, letters opened, letters waiting, the territorial recorder's latest communication about the second county's case, a note from May describing her daughter's reaction to the photograph of the meadow, The lamp on the desk was the good kind, oil that burned clean and long. Ben came in from the cold with frost dusting his coat and the door closing behind him on the November night. He crossed the room to the hearth, where the dovetailed box sat on the shelf empty of its documents now, returned to what it had been before her father put anything inside it. A well-made box, dovetailed corners, 2 small brass hinges, constructed by hands that knew the difference between work done to last and work done to satisfy. He had made it the winter after Nora was born, and carried it up a mountain in the spring, and left it where it would hold, and it had held and it had done its work, and now it sat on a shelf in a warm room. She had been going to tell him in the morning, but he was looking at her with the particular attention of a man who has learned to read her silences. And this silence was not a working silence, and not a tired one, and not any of the silences he had catalogued through the months of occupying the same rooms, and the same problems, and the same early mornings, and the same late lamps. She set the pen down. He crossed to the desk and sat beside her, not across, beside, which was the choice that meant something. He took the hand that was not holding the unfinished letter, and held it in both of his with the same care he gave to things worth keeping. She told him. 4 words. The kind of sentence that carries everything by carrying nothing extra. He was still in the way he received large things making room inside for a fact that had changed the interior dimensions. The way a room changes when something significant is moved into it, and the proportions shift and then settle, and the room understands, it was always meant to hold this. The after, he said. She looked at him. What? The mountain. You told Wade. He looked at their hands on the desk. The watching part is the easy part. It's the after that tells you who you were. He met her eyes. This is the after, and I know exactly who I am in it. Outside the window, Sunder Ridge held its snow in the early winter dark. The meadow was up there invisible from the valley floor but present, as it had always been present, holding what it held. 6 wagons in an open arc, a door facing east, and on the driver's bench of the first wagon, a small carved horse with a mended leg, waiting for whoever came next up the trail in the spring, when May's daughter would make her first visit and find it there in the morning light whole, attended to, kept. The lamp burned. In the house at the end of the street, the after had begun.